across the country and improve schools across the country so that everyone is in these really vibrant, research-rich staff rooms where you're just flourishing, you're getting access to the best expertise, great professional development, and we can improve our profession by sharing the best expertise across the system. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about expertise in teaching. And a lot of this research is actually generic across different subject areas, but actually a particularly large amount of the research comes from maths. It's always great that lots of the research comes from maths. So let's just talk about a few differences between as you gain expertise in teaching, what does it actually look like? What's the difference between a really expert maths teacher and a less expert maths teacher? And as I say, this is true across lots of subject areas. So the first thing we know about as you gain more expertise is that you have lots more experiences of the classroom to share. You have lots more in your head. So because you've seen so many different classrooms, and importantly, because you've seen them from the perspective of a teacher, then you are able to recognize situations much more rapidly. When a beginning teacher goes into a classroom, then the only library they have to draw upon is what it was like sitting in the class as a pupil. But as a teacher, you can just recognize so many situations. Things seem so much more familiar, much less is likely to surprise you. And importantly, as soon as you can see a situation, you're much more likely to be able to predict what's going to happen next. So you're more likely to predict if there's a behavior issue or a misconception or an understanding problem coming up. Because you have this huge library of teacher memories to draw upon, then you also can more quickly identify the salient features, the important features. So for example, as you're listening to answers, as someone is sharing their answers in a classroom, you're much more likely to say, no, there's a tiny little misconception there. And if we don't deal with that now, that will be a problem later. Whereas as a beginning teacher, you're just hearing lots and lots of words. Similarly, if you're looking at the classroom and seeing how everyone is behaving, then as an expert teacher, you're much more likely to spot the subtle little issue going on in that corner over there, which from memory, you know, is more likely to cause you problems later. But also, once you're an expert teacher, then you are also more likely to be able to figure out what's not happening. So for example, if I'm teaching a certain topic, and I'm thinking, well, I'm not hearing certain sorts of answers developing. I'd normally expect to hear that. Or actually, I'm looking at the answers across the class, and I'm not really hearing this particular aspect, or I'm not seeing that in exercise books. And because I've got a much bigger memory of what I'm expecting to see, then it's much easier for me to kind of adapt my teaching to say, I'm not seeing that yet. Again, as a beginning teacher, you're much less likely to see that. As a novice, you're less likely to know what's not there. I'm just seeing what I'm seeing. Also, because you're less overwhelmed with what you're seeing, you can look at a classroom and it so rapidly matches patterns that you have already in your head from loads of previous lessons. Then you can spot little discrepancies. So you can say, oh, that's interesting how that one pupil is doing that there and that one pupil is doing it there. And rather than as a beginning teacher where you just sort of see the whole classroom and you're getting a sense of what's happening overall, a more expert teacher will notice more little details like interactions between students, and you'll remember more details about how you interacted with the pupils as well. So it's really interesting how the perception is different, and there's more in fact as well. So because you're more aware of this kind of variation of what's going on, you're also more aware in terms of differentiation of actually I can see that person is struggling more here, but also the subtleties, not sort of a less able, more able feature, but more, okay, I can see you're struggling with that aspect and you're doing really well in that aspect, and so on. Similarly, because as an expert teacher, you have so many memories in your head, then you're much more likely to spot problems at an earlier stage. So a beginning teacher will sort of teach a topic, do a test, and right at the end go, oh, people didn't understand that. But as a more experienced teacher, you're much more likely to hear subtle cues that say there will be a problem later, and you're better at asking questions that will draw out the beginnings of misunderstanding, the beginnings of misconception, and then you can stop the problems, which of course means you can deal with them at an early stage. And you can pay more attention to the indicators of learning. So interestingly, when you ask beginning teachers and expert teachers to recount what happened in a lesson, then beginning teachers are much more likely to talk about the behavior, and they sat down on time, they did what they were told, they got on with the tasks, and people actually sort of doing what they're told. And whereas expert teachers are much more likely to focus on the learning, the indicators, the subtleties of differences in learning. So again, because you get more comfortable over time and you have more memories to draw upon, you focus more on what eventually you know is going to make the bigger difference later on. This one sounds complicated, but essentially, the other really interesting thing is if you sort of have a video of what went on in the classroom and you stop the beginning teacher and say what happened there, they're more likely to say this is what's happening right now. Whereas an expert teacher is much more likely to say, well, a few minutes ago, that pupil looked like she was going off task there, then she wandered over there and she did that, and then that interacted with that person, and now I can see that this has happened. So again, because there's so many, you're much more efficient at looking and recognizing and interpreting what's going on, you're more likely to remember over time little patterns of behavior. Now that's really important, because that means when you, as an expert teacher, react to things, you're much less likely to say, this has happened, I must react. And you're more likely to say, well, here's the story over the last sort of 5-10 minutes, even the last couple of lessons, and now I can interpret and do something with it, because you're picking out the more important features. And here's a really important one as well. When you first go into the classroom and something surprising happens, you know, I don't know, pupil suddenly stands up, someone bursts in the door or something. It's the first time it's ever happened. You're already nervous. And the adrenaline rush you get inside you is so shocking to you that you're completely sort of overwhelmed by the feelings inside your body, the muscle tightness, the adrenaline, shoulder tightness. And it's quite shocking because it's unusual to you. Whereas as an expert teacher, it's not that the adrenaline doesn't happen, but it's like, oh, right, yeah, I recognize that. I know exactly what I can do. A, I understand how to deal with it. B, I've got more different tools in my toolkit, but you're just less surprised. You can react better and you can self-regulate better. So it's, we all know how tough the beginning teacher year is, and that's one of the reasons why. Expert teachers also do things differently, and it's related to what they perceive. So one of these things is you're much less likely for someone to plan and then use a set script. So as an expert teacher, to be honest, you can kind of go in and say, well, I've got 5 or 6 different ways to explain the same thing. And you're much more likely to keep asking questions, lots of formative assessment, and adapt and change as you go. Whereas you tend to see that novice teachers, beginning teachers, sort of, I have one way to explain, I will do that. And they're less likely to be able to adapt and flex it along the way. Also, because you can understand in more depth, you've got more memories in your head of how to kind of attack this particular topic or question, expert teachers are much more likely to have probing questions, and then they can flex things, but also there are just loads more questions focused on the most important things, because you know, right, I need to check that, I need to check that, I need to make sure that's built. And gradually over time, you're consistently using lots and lots and lots and lots of formative assessment to focus on the main things, and then focus on the big arc of a topic. I remember the very first time I started teaching maths, and I started out as a physics teacher. So when I picked up maths and I was teaching, say, year 8 maths, I really didn't kind of understand what was taught in year 7 and year 6 and year 5 and what would be taught later. And it's only after a few years of teaching maths, eventually I could say, right, I could situate this topic based on what I knew was taught in primary and what I knew was going to be taught in GCSE and what I knew was going to be taught in A-level, for example. So I can situate things in a longer arc, but also I'm less likely to think about this lesson as a unit, and I'm more likely to say this topic, this concept, I know where you are in the broader scheme of things. So I can pick out the key theme and the skill and the understanding development. And then I can be more efficient. So if I'm an expert teacher, then I spend less time on less important questions. I can go straight to the most important question. I can focus straight on the explanation that's going to deal with the biggest issue. I'm asking more questions more flexibly, more easily, and I'm more efficient partly because I'm spending less time thinking, what do I need to do next? I've just got, it's kind of more automatic in my head. So actually you can often find that expert teachers can quite rapidly diagnose and assess and deal with particular issues more efficiently than a beginning teacher, which is not to say beginning teachers can't also be effective, of course. It's just they're less likely to be flexible, more likely to be thrown off track. And also as an expert teacher, a lot of my planning for a lesson is actually thinking about checking when a problem is going to happen and then responding to misconceptions and misunderstanding, because I'm so much clearer about where the problems could appear later, I can deal with them sooner. So I act earlier. That's really important. I head off issues. This is also true of behavior as well. And you find this is one of the things I remember as a beginning teacher going into a classroom with this amazing teacher. I mean, she was just extraordinary. And it was a class that I'd seen really misbehaving with another teacher. And they were just behaving beautifully. And what I couldn't see as a beginning teacher is what she was doing. I couldn't see what she was doing to make the behavior so great. And actually, she already knew where issues could occur later, and everything she did, the calmness of her voice, the way she moved around the classroom, little acknowledgements and just small interactions were heading off issues before they happened. And she could immediately spot, mood is different today, the body language is different. But it was far too subtle for me to see. And so actually, I needed her really almost to narrate what was happening and what she'd done before to get the class to that level. Whereas as a beginning teacher, someone comes in and I'm just a bit scared and I'm a bit worried, kind of say, no, don't do that and don't do this. And I want to react to things, and that gets me very adrenaline. And so as an expert teacher, eventually you gain this confidence that you kind of see, look, there's an issue over there. I'm going to have to deal with it in a minute. And I can go over and I can refer to the whole sequence of events that's happened. And also I'm more subtle in terms of the different influences that have influenced where we've got to now. So it's really interesting, all of these different ways that teachers act. But also then expert teachers plan differently. And this is really important. So when an expert teacher plans, then they tend to, rather than say, oh, I need to cover this, this, and this. So it's much less about what I'm going to cover and explain. It's much more about what I need people to learn and what misconceptions I'm linking to and where I need to prepare them for the next lesson. Whereas as a beginning teacher, you're much more likely to say, I need to cover this topic. I need to say this. I need to go over this thing. They need to do these questions. Interestingly, there's been a few studies that say if you give, say, a teacher who's been teaching 1 or 2 years, the challenge of teaching a completely new class they've never taught them before, and then you give the same thing to an expert, experts are often less comfortable with less information. So experts will often say, yeah, but I kind of need to know what they've learned before. Like, I can teach a standard lesson, but in my head, I'm automatically wanting to make links to what they've done before. And expert teachers are often less comfortable with having no information and just going straight in, or they'll plan loads more formative assessment in because they just need to understand how to connect things together. Whereas a less experienced teacher, a novice, is more likely to say sort of, right, here's the things I'm going to cover, I'm going to explain this, and so on. So it's really interesting, these subtle differences of the planning. And I'm sure everyone has experienced this, the more experienced you are, the quicker your planning is. And you find this so frequently that beginning teachers, oh my goodness, I remember the first few lessons I planned. I took hours and hours and hours because each little tiny bit, this 5 minutes, what do I do? And frankly, even planning 5 minutes felt overwhelming. It's like, I have to plan to think about so much in 5 minutes to get them in the door. What am I going to do? How am I going to do this? And of course, as an expert, then you sort of gradually get to the point where you don't need to think about so many aspects of the lesson, and therefore the stuff you do plan is the really important bit. Right, here's an explanation I want to use, here's a question I want to use, and therefore, because you'll tend to just focus on the key moments, then you can be much more flexible around that, and you're much more likely to think, okay, well, I could use this, or maybe this, or maybe this, or maybe this. So your planning is quicker, more efficient, it's more focused on the key moments, and you're less likely to plan one lesson. You're much more likely to plan a series of lessons and say, okay, over the next few lessons, this is where we are. I need to think about these things. And then you more flexibly use them in the lessons, less focused on the one lesson unit. And you're more likely to be able to differentiate, because actually by focusing on the key moments, you know there are different pathways people might take, and you can think to yourself, I'll use this task, and then these people can do those sorts of exercises, and then I can take this little group and do a bit of quick in-class intervention and so on. So everything becomes so much more efficient. And I'm sure you've all experienced that, this idea that as you go on, planning becomes less and less detailed, but actually more focused on the really important stuff. And you need to do much less sort of scripting of, oh my goodness, I don't know how to deal with that. I need to say that and then say that and then say that. So how do we use this to help teachers improve? Well, I mean, all of this is, it's really interesting how all of this then leads us to think about professional development. So about our own learning as teachers, but also if you're a school leader, how do you plan your learning for your department or for your whole school? And what we need to recognize is that simply saying, here is a good way to teach, do that, it's not going to work. It's not going to work for everybody. And similarly, novices and experts, the more expertise you have, it's so different the way you think that actually we can't just kind of do what I would call either sheep dip CPD or one size fits all CPD and expect that it'll work really well for everyone. So we do need to make the work we do in schools a lot more focused on developing our perception, our insights, and our thinking, and much less about, I need to show that I am doing this. There's far too much goes on in schools, which is about, do the jazz hands, when the person comes in to observe you. I need to show that I did my starter. I need to show that I did my retrieval practice. I need to show that I did this, that, or the other. And actually, it's less. I'm much less interested in the practice you're doing than almost what were the other options and how did you get there and what did you notice and what's your logic for doing that and how do you think it learns what you're doing next. It's not that it's not important what you're doing, but I need to understand it in context. So we need to help people think more deeply and have this sort of greater expertise. And similarly then, I need to help every colleague, I need to help myself see lots of different classrooms. It's really valuable for me to see the same lesson taught a few different times and then get those teachers together and really reflect on, okay, why did you do that? And at this moment you said this, why did you do that? Oh, that's different to what you did. Could you explain that to me? And we need to articulate our thinking, what we're choosing to do, what we're noticing, what we're seeing, what we're predicting. And then help people have more than one classroom strategy. And there is this sort of remedial approach that we sometimes see where people say, just teach it this way. And that really only works if you're completely lost. Then, if I had no idea what to do, then giving me one script is sort of fine. But as soon as I've mastered that script in any way, I need to have loads of flexible classroom strategies, because a really expert teacher is not just they follow a great script, but they're really responsive on what's going on. That's one of the reasons why formative assessment for learning is so important, because it's all about activating the teacher and the learner, really engaging with each other, lots of formative assessment, lots of engagements, and people being really responsive and students beginning to learn from and with each other and people being really reflective. And it's a much more adaptive, responsive, flexible classroom. And then I need to plan for that. We need to move people away from sort of, here's your grid for this lesson, you need to plan on this sheet. And we need to kind of say, well, what are the key moments? What's your key questions for the day? What's going to be the most important explanation? What are the alternatives to that? What are the misconceptions you know from before? How are you going to what are the big questions that you'll be focusing on? What are the less important questions that maybe would be red herrings we don't need to worry about so much at this stage? So longer term flexible planning, which is why maths teachers need to get together and discuss how they plan lessons and then reflect back on those lessons after and say, how did your planning inform a really flexible lesson? We also need to help ourselves think about, right, what were the most important things that happened in that lesson? And the thing that maybe got your nerves jangling might have been the behavior issue or the little bit of disruption, but we need to kind of not just focus on that. We need to say, right, actually, here are the key moments in this lesson. And that's why going in and out of each other's classrooms is immensely powerful, but we can't go in and say, oh yeah, I thought your lesson was good because blah, blah, blah. We need to have conversation, we need to have dialogue about it. And importantly, and there's a whole extra section, which I won't have time to talk about here, about how expectations are incredibly important. And the one challenge that expert teachers have in particular is that our expectations of what's possible can get fixed. It's the most important thing. If you're saying, actually, I feel I'm more flexible, I'm more expert, the biggest challenge for you is to powerfully, constantly, consistently challenge what you think is possible from certain pupils, because your expectations are transmitted to what those pupils hear from you in the challenge of the level of questions and so on. And so we need to constantly say, right, how can we show you that for certain pupils, actually, maybe there are ways to change what they do. Actually, you might think this pupil is not very able, but actually it is within their power and your power to make a change here. So we need to show all of us how actually there's more in the classroom that actually is under our control and that we can change. And this idea of malleability, it is changeable. These things are not, okay, well, that child will never do well, or, they'll always misbehave, or actually that child will always be great at what they do. We can't have these fixed views. We need these more flexible views of children. So it's worth remembering that actually you don't just sort of go in chunks all the way from a novice teacher to an expert teacher. Actually, it's dependent on teaching similar material. And again, everyone has experienced this where maybe you completely switch curriculum. It's like, I've never taught this. I remember moving from a bunch of A-level units that I was very, very happy with to teaching a new one on decision maths. And while I loved it, it was brilliant, it wasn't a familiar material to me. And I went much more back to kind of plodding through and covering the content until after a couple of years, I was much more able to understand, okay, no, I can see how addressing this now deals with that later. Similarly, if you say go from one school, I don't know, say you went from a school which was, I say, a leafy grammar school or something, and you've got certain sort of views on how those pupils learn, and then you move to another school where it's maybe a much more disadvantaged area, far more issues, maybe they've been taught in a very different way, then it's very alien to you. Your expectations of what's happening and what they're doing just don't fit. And so you can revert to a more novice-like state. Similarly, if somebody says, oh, you've been teaching the way you like, and oh, by the way, we're totally changing the way you have to teach now, then you revert to much more of a novice. So it's just worth thinking about that. It's not a linear thing. You develop expertise over time, but changes that are forced upon us force us to become less expert. And I think it's fair to say some of the current circumstances of being forced to teach online, having to go back and teach in bubbles, maybe teach in different ways, that has forced us out of our expert zone and much more into, oh, I need to cover this, this, and this. And so we need to build the expertise back up. And as I say, expert teachers asked to teach non-familiar topics. If you'd asked me to go and teach a PE lesson, I would definitely not be an expert of what to see and what to respond to. And I've gone back to, right, I have to do that and do that and do that and do that. It's the way we set cover, isn't it? You say, cover this, say this, do this, and not, here's your responsive lesson that you have to do. So we go right back to novice levels of perception, novice levels of behaviors, novice levels of what we think is possible. So what's the sort of CPD we can do for ourselves that's likely to work? Well, it's less focused on inflexible scripts. It's more focused on developing insights and bigger curriculum flow. It uses experienced practitioners to talk about the insights they've got and the depth and breadth and flexibility. It's more likely to focus on what teachers can change, formative assessment, anticipating issues, recognizing when to use different strategies. So, all of these sorts of things make a really big difference. So if we're going to design it in school, we need lots and lots of great dialogue between teachers, lots of opportunities for teachers to talk about what they do and why they do it, lots of engagement with research. Don't just say research says, but we need to figure out why and how things are happening, and lots of constructive challenge. Yeah, but why do you think that? Why did you do that? What could be another way of doing it? And so on. So these are really important things, and building this culture that supports and doesn't hinder teacher development is incredibly important. Now, I want you to do a quick survey. So if you could just whack this into your browser, and in fact, I'm just going to copy that into the chat as well.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Just going and grabbing that. So then we can quickly do the survey, and I can just see where you think some of your schools are on this. So, right, there's the link. I've just put it in the chat. That might be it works better that way. You can click on it now.
Yeah.
So if you just click on that, fill in that survey, and then in just a sec, I'm going to show you some of those results. While we're waiting for some of those results to come in, so again, just go click on that. Everyone do it. It'll be really useful. Thank you. Then Flavia, should we just have a little look at some questions then?
Yeah, we can do that. Okay, so just to make it clear, there's a link there. Please go for it with a click and answer the questions, so then we can have a live results of those questions. And yeah, there are already a lot of questions for you, David. The presentation is going great so far. Thank you very much. So Hassan asked, just for advice, how do I choose my maths field? How do I know which one to fit my knowledge? As we were talking about that in the very beginning.
How do I choose the field?
Mm-hmm.
Not completely sure I quite understand the question. Is it kind of what area to develop expertise in, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, to be honest, I think you have to start somewhere. So whatever your timetable to do, I guess, when you start, that's really important. I would also say reading lots about sort of the misconceptions that pupils can have is really important, but also watching lots of maths lessons is really important. And don't just watch them and assume you're going to know what's happening. If you can find videos of maths lessons and talk with a really experienced practitioner and say, what do you think is happening here? Why are they doing it? And then you say why you think it's happening, and then you say, ask them what could be another way of doing it, and how could it be improved, and what, pause, what could you do next? What have you noticed? I think those sorts of things could be really important.
Yeah, sounds good. And a question from Isolina. What are the key indicators that will define the transition between a novice teacher to an expert teacher?
So, I mean, it is a continuum. And of course, it does depend on the topic you're teaching. And it might be you taught this topic loads, and it might be that one you haven't taught so much. I think there were always things where I just loved doing anything around mechanics. I loved doing stuff around statistics. And there were other topics where I don't think I was ever quite as good. I don't think I had quite such love for them. Anything involved a spreadsheet, I could never be happier. So I think it's difficult to say exactly, but I would start saying, think about how you're planning the lesson. Are you planning to do A, B, C, D, E, or are you beginning to say, actually, I'm now focusing on key questions, key concepts, and those sorts of things. Yeah. So yeah, I think probably that would be some sort of key thinking in that, really.
Right. And then an interesting question from Melanie here, saying, do you kind of become a novice teacher every time you start with a new class again?
Not entirely, no, because what you'll do is you'll use your previous memories of maths teaching to kind of predict what's going to happen, and you'll base it on what you already know. So actually, over time, it's less and less likely you're going to have a class that completely surprises you. So you might sort of over time begin to kind of get that sense of, actually, well, this is a bit like this, this is a bit like this. Of course, that's a problem, because that means this class might be capable of more than any of your previous classes were capable of, and you might not necessarily reflect on that. So it's worth saying, as you become more expert, you assume that children are more like the children you've seen before, but actually that's where some of the issues might potentially be, right? So yeah, there we go. I'm just gonna, because a few people put put a couple of questions in their spreadsheet as well, Flavia. So just one of them I saw here is, how do we separate sort of what someone called our political ideologies from pedagogical choices? This is a really interesting one, which is like, you must teach this way because we believe it's right, and therefore, if you don't teach that way, that's a problem. Ultimately, for me, it's all about going back to the evidence. And that most people will understand that says, for example, if someone comes to you and says, say like, oh, everything has to be completely knowledge-rich, knowledge-based, knowledge-rich, and there's some good evidence behind that, then I think one of the ways is kind of say, well, what's great pedagogy? And try and explain it to them in ways that maybe resonates with their views. So I would always say, if you're challenged with the way someone is constraining you, seek first to understand, actually, so find out, well, what is it you believe is really important, and then try and explain what you're doing in ways that really resonate for them. It's a bit like, if a child is struggling with something, you kind of ask them what they understand so far, and then you try and explain it in ways that will really work for them. So I would think the same thing, really. Flavia, another question from your side?
Yeah. From Janet, there is here, are there teachers who never really become experts? Is that okay? And then if you want to apply to become a head teacher or head of department, should you be more closer to the expert level on the continuum, or can you already become a head even though you're
really
a novice teacher?
Yeah. So sorry, what the first one? So the second one was department. But the first one again was?
Are there teachers that don't really move on?
Yeah. So it's very interesting, actually. There is a sense that everybody improves rapidly in their first 3 to 4 years on average, and then actually a lot of us kind of stop getting better at that stage. And no one exactly knows why, but my theory would be it's a lot about, you begin to get so much becomes habitual that it becomes quite difficult to shift what you do. You tend to make tiny little tweaks to what you do. Right. And you might think your practice is evolving, but often it's not in a really meaningful way. And I think one of the most important things we can do is to really challenge ourselves and go to other schools, watch videos, see things where similar pupils are achieving much more, and then really dig into why that might be. And then we need to then try things out in our own classrooms. So I think, first of all, constantly challenge yourself. What's possible? What are new ways of teaching? And why would that work better with your pupils? When it comes to being head of department, there's an administrative side. There's a very management side of that. Yep. There's sort of the leadership side, which is having conversations with people, organizing it, relationships. And then, yes, there's sort of the subject specific bit, which might be about how you arrange resources and how you organize things. And it's quite operational and also logistical. But then also, yes, there's a pedagogical side. And I don't think you necessarily have to be a sort of, you know, at the expert level in all of those. But I also think to be a really good subject leader, you do need to constantly deepen your subject knowledge and show that you're open to doing that. But also we have to create a space where everyone else is doing. And one of the things we know in departments and schools where people improve quickly is the leaders, the school leaders and the department leaders and subject leaders and phase leaders are the ones who show, I am learning and I'm creating an environment in which everyone should learn and I'm going to learn with you. So I think, you know, I have to say in some schools I'm beginning to see this structure where you get the operational logistical management side separated out from the pedagogical expert subject knowledge coaching side. And actually that can work quite well, but in your school that might not be the case.
Yeah, just follow up from there. There was a question from Andrea asking, if you take over a leadership role and then you're obviously teaching less in the classroom, do you lose some of the skills that you had acquired in classroom?
I mean, I do think it's possible to lose skills. That said, we know from expertise. So if you think you hadn't ridden a bike for a long time and you go back to riding a bike, you might be a little wobbly at first of all, but you'll very rapidly bring back those skills because the memories fade away, but you can really quickly get them back. It's a bit like if you haven't visited an area for a very long time. Firstly, it feels weird, but you really quickly remember where you're going and go, oh yeah, and you can re-establish memories very quickly. You can re-establish thinking patterns much more quickly. It's like the same way that if you've been in the gym a lot and you stop for a year and then you go back, you'll re-establish the muscle patterns and so on much more quickly than trying to establish them in the first place. That's one of the reasons why, you know, being in school is really important, because even if someone forgets it but they have to come back to it later, they'll remember it because of the work you did with them, right? Just a question I saw from one side is, if you have one piece of advice for someone starting maths in September, what would it be? I mean, there are so many things. I think first of all, don't overburden yourselves with reading too much stuff and trying to do too many different things. But I would say watch lots of maths lessons. There are lots of clips of maths lessons, and whether you go to, for example, Chartered College have got loads of maths clips. I think their early career framework resource center is brilliant, and I would definitely go and look at that. Watch lots of lessons, and then watch lessons and listen to teachers talk about them, and also read some really good books about the how and the why people are teaching. You know, I mean, and you're going to hear some really great teachers, but I think, you know, listen, don't watch what they do and think I'll copy that. Listen to the logic behind it, listen to what's possible, listen to why this topic follows that topic. And the more you establish that map in your head, the easier it will be to start referring to that later.
Sounds good. We have 1 minute left on this Q&A. Is there another question that you want to answer from the spreadsheet?
Any advice on how to improve my team's own desire to take part in professional development? Yeah, I mean, one of the key things here is relevance. Everyone gets bored of sitting in professional development they don't think is relevant. So don't begin by saying, this is really important, do this. Start by saying, number one, out of interest for everyone here, what's the best professional learning you've ever had in your career? When were you most engaged and interested? And then say, oh, how could we get more of that? That's really important. Secondly, what are the big challenges, frustrations we've got here in terms of how our pupils are learning? Okay, what could we do to deal with those? Start with what your team is really, really engaged with. And then if you can map that to what your whole school is telling you have to do as well, that's fine. But people really like being listened to. So listen to them and then repeat back what you think you've said and said, I think I'm hearing this. Is that right? Let them correct you and then say, okay, so based on that understanding, let's do this. That's a really powerful way. But that first question, when did you learn best? When were you most excited and engaged in learning? Listen to that and then say, wow, that's exciting. How could we do more of that? And then they might not trust you initially, but eventually they'll get warmed up and engaged and excited. And for most people, not everyone, for most people, you can get them re-engaged in learning.
Yeah, sounds good. That was brilliant, David. Thank you very, very much. I'm sure everybody, there were lots of more questions on the chat.
I've just quickly put my contact details at the bottom here, david.weston@tdtrust.org, and there's the website if you're really interested. And I forgot to put, I'm at @informededu on Twitter, so say hi. But otherwise, thank you so much for having me today.
No, thank you very much. And there are a lot of other questions. So please, everybody, if we didn't have time to cover your questions, go for Twitter and ask David over there, and I'm sure he's gonna find time to answer. Thank you very much, David. Great, so now we have our first round of short talks, which are by, let's start with Gemma Scott, then Gabriella Veglio, and then Daniel Percy. So Gemma, are you around?
I am indeed.
Hello. Yes.
We're good?
Yeah, we're good. I can't see you.
Is that better?
Yes, there you go. Okay, good.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So here it is, Saturday, the 4th of July, the day they're branding England's Independence Day. From this morning, we've got so many more choices of what we can do than we've had for months. Yet here we all are, sat at a maths conference. So why is that? Well, either you're hiding from your family, or you're avoiding doing some chores, or you're really, really passionate about maths education. And if it is the latter, then you've probably heard countless inspiring things already from David, and I know you'll go on and hear many, many more. So I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about how we can take what we hear at conferences, what we learn through our wider reading, and what we hear on Twitter back to our departments, and how we can have an impact in our own practice and in the practice of others who haven't had the same opportunities as us. As Flavia said, my name is Gemma Scott, and I am the face behind Director Maths on Twitter. So before we think about how we're going to implement these strategies, it's important that we know exactly what we're going to implement. So there's that wonderful quote from Dylan William that says, "Everything works somewhere and nothing works everywhere." And for me, that really warns me against being a magpie. I need to make sure that when I see something, it's actually a solution to a problem I actually have. And not, I'm going to create the problem to fit that solution. Because when we start to think about bringing other people in our departments on board, it's going to be important how we sell this. And if it's a problem that we actually have, that's going to become more attractive to them. If you are interested in implementing evidence-based practice and you haven't already, I really would urge you to go away and have a look at the EASH guidance report on putting evidence to work. But for me, there's one standout thing, and that's the first point that they make, and that's that implementation is a process and not an event. So as teachers who are bringing ideas back to departments, or if you're privileged like me to be able to lead a department, then there's some work that we can put in behind the scenes in order to ensure that our implementation is as successful as possible. So this morning I'm going to talk about the EAST model. Now, EAST is an acronym, and it's initially a model for changing adult behaviour that was coined by the Behavioural Insights team. So if you're interested in looking into it a bit more, that's where you need to go. But for me, it's something that I keep in mind when bringing new ideas back to the department to try and make that implementation as successful as possible. So the E stands for easy. So how can we make an initiative as easy as possible to implement? Well, do the staff have all the knowledge that they need to implement that successfully? Can you provide them with a template? Can you provide them with some time to work on it? So we're all looking at retrieval at the moment, and I think it was Catherine Darwin originally who came up with the last lesson last week, last topic, last term. But by providing that template, can we give staff some examples, and can we make it easier for them to go off and implement? The A stands for attractive. So this is where it's crucial that we're considering, is this a problem that the team actually have? Because if it is, then the solution to that becomes more attractive. So we all know that feedback is more effective when it's targeted, when it's personalised, and crucially when students do something with that. So how do we achieve that without it becoming a workload issue? Why is it attractive to get involved with this style of feedback? Well, we devised some marking codes. So the staff spend their time thinking about the questions that they're going to ask, thinking about what the students are going to do with that feedback, and it's the students who actually write down the feedback themselves following the marking code. The S then stands for social. So how can you make your new initiative as social as possible? Can you work on it collaboratively? Can you meet and talk about it? Can you all encourage each other? So next year, we are starting in our faculty a book club, and that will form the basis of our faculty meeting time. So we're going to be studying next year How I Wish I'd Taught Maths by Craig Barton, but we're going to look at a study guide that I've put together to ensure that staff have that template to make it easy, but also there's questions in there to prompt that discussion afterwards to make it as social as possible as well. And the last one, the T, is timely. So we said, is this a problem that I actually have? But it's crucial that we consider if now is the right time to solve that problem as well. Because otherwise, as David said, if we're forcing or we're changing too much at one time, we risk staff going back into that novice state. So speaking of time, I'm running out of it. I've not quite got enough time to go into what that Norwegian is about. I will be putting a blog post out later on this weekend if you are interested in any of the 4 examples that I've given. But this morning, let's get that discussion going on Twitter. What have you heard? And crucially, can the EAST model help you to implement that once we all get back to school in our departments? Can we make it easy? Can we make it attractive? Can we make it social? And is it timely? Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. That was great. A lot of people asking you for the template for the study, the book club. If they ask you on Twitter, you can share something there, right?
Absolutely. So far I have got the first 2 chapters of Craig's book done. So I can publish that, and then it will keep going throughout the year, and I can update.
Brilliant, thank you. But sorry, I messed up before. I actually read the names on the second round of short talks instead of the first one. So let's go back to the first one now. And we're gonna have Chris. Chris White. Are you there, Chris?
Hello, yeah, can you see me?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Your turn.
And can you just checking, can you see the screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Morning, everyone. My name's Chris White. I'm a maths subject leader at a large comprehensive school in Oxfordshire. And today I want to demonstrate a model that I originally developed to simplify and explain our spiral maths curriculum to non-specialists, to help them see the multidimensional progression within it. And now, as it happens, it's going to be very useful for September curriculum discussions as well. It's a very, very brief snapshot, so excuse me if I go too fast. So our curriculum, if this works, excuse me, our curriculum is obviously built on the foundations that are laid in primary school. And then if we zoom out to the whole secondary school view, you can see that as the year 7 units build, they build on what's been taught so far in the year, but also on the prior knowledge from primary school. And then as year 8 comes along, the same thing happens. You can begin to see these spokes emerging where each topic in year 7 is developed in year 8, constructed radially as well as kind of turn-wise from the center, excuse me. So, and then year 9 builds on top of that.
You muted yourself, Chris. There, good.
Thank you. It's a very simplified model. Obviously, it expects each topic to fit neatly into 5 years. But I think you can see the progression there, that radial progression through a topic and that turn-wise progression as well through the year. If we then isolate just one topic, I've picked percentages here, then in year 7, you may well do percentage increase and decrease. And then in year 8, you build on that radially, you build on that percentages topic with percentage change using multipliers. But of course, turn-wise throughout year 7, you may have done, you needed to do some work on multiplying by numbers between 0 and 1. Radially again into year 9, in percentages, you might do original value problems, but turn-wise through year 8, you would have also done some inverse operations and some reciprocals and maybe some other work to lead into that. Similarly, in year 10, we're doing compound interest, for example. Throughout year 9, radially, you may well have done more work on powers and roots and effective use of the calculator. And in year 11, it could really go anywhere from here, but I've chosen rates of change there. But does it really look like this? That's my question. And I'd say it doesn't really look like that with those sectors, those concentric sectors, if that's what you'd like to call them. I'd contend that it looks a little bit more like this. So in year 7, we teach percentage change, and then in year 8, they've forgotten stuff. So we end up teaching percentage change again to a certain extent, and that's fine. Don't panic with that. Learning requires forgetting, so that's okay. We address those gaps in year 7 and build on them in year 8. And again in year 8, into year 9, we build over the top. That's fine. And again in year 10, and again in year 11. So just homing in on those learning gaps, this is what the knowledge gaps might look like at the end of year 7 as we look to build on that topic in year 8. So in year 8, we address those learning gaps, and year 8 passes turn-wise, and we address those learning gaps, I apologise, and we do percentages as multipliers. But as year 8 goes on, then those learning gaps appear again in some of the year 8 content. So we address those in year 9 and build over the top of them, and then address them in year 10, build over the top of them, and the same in year 11, but obviously no gaps in year 11, because as we all know, they don't forget anything in year 11. Just zoom out then to the whole curriculum. Let's take Rihanna's journey. Rihanna is currently finishing year 8. This was her last year, or her class last year, with some learning gaps there in the year 7 curriculum. And then in year 8 came along and addressed those gaps and built over the top of them. That's great, excellent. So at the end of this year, we fixed everything, but of course we haven't, because learning gaps emerge in year 8 as well. But don't panic, because year 9 is going to come along next year, and we're going to address those learning gaps and build over the top of them, except this came along. And Rihanna and her class have probably now got a bank of understanding that looks something like this, with a heck of a lot of learning gaps towards the end of the year, or even that where we didn't teach a few units. But that's still okay. Don't panic, is my message. Because next year you can trust your curriculum, and it's going to address those learning gaps and build over the top of it. What we do need to do is look at those particular units and make sure we take the time to plan carefully for them, make the time to plan carefully for them, and address those learning gaps deeply. I'm going to skip, because of time, the quotes from Hans Rosling. I'll leave those on the slides, and just leave you with a slide that is where we're at really as a department, what we still need to think about and discuss between now and September. I hope that's been a helpful model of a curriculum, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. That was very great and very clear. I really liked it. Can you tell people your Twitter handle again before we move on?
Yeah, it's at @OneChrisWhite, ONE Chris White.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. So now next one up is Robert. Hello. Can't hear you.
So
hello.
You can see me now, and you can hear me
Yes.
as well. So just a very quick short session, because I allowed Chris to overrun there because he's such a nice guy. So I was going to talk to you this morning about networking, learning and sharing on mathematics, and I'm at RJS 2212, Robert J. Smith. There's plenty of Rob Smiths about, so hopefully you can see my first screen there. And what I wanted to talk to you about was that there are many networks around the country, and the MA and the ATM are 2 of them, and they have local branch activity. And here in the East Midlands, I am the MA ATM Joint Branch Secretary. So here are the guiding principles for the ATM, and you can see here that the MA are the oldest subject association, and will be 150 next year. So you might want to look at membership to those networks there, because they're an opportunity to look at various teaching ideas at all the different phases. I'm also Secretary of Teaching Committee, and we're always looking for members to come and join our subcommittees for primary 11 to 16 and post 16 and more. As COVID-19 has shown us, teaching and learning can occur anywhere and at any time, and hopefully you're enjoying this significance. 2 weeks ago we had MathsConf, which is another opportunity that's run by LaSalle Education, and all the sessions and the work recordings are there. And the Royal Institution also have their maths masterclasses, and there's plenty of opportunities to get involved in some real life maths problems there. Socially, Joe Morgan has organised some fantastic events such as Chris Maths and Some Maths, and in London for Pi and Maths or Empanada Maths. It's great to get out there and talk maths and listen and learn with others. But since it's an opportunity to do some maths, I feel we should write down the first 6 terms of any arithmetic sequence. So if you can drop into the chat just the first 6 terms of any sequence. For example, you might pick 4, 7, 10, 13, 16, 19, and you could write those as 2 simultaneous equations. So very quickly, because I know we're short of time. And if I were to tell you that the solution to those 2 simultaneous equations were x equals -1 and y equals 2, and hopefully that's true for everyone. And here you can see I've used autograph to get my solution to that. And I'll just wait for my cursor to come back to the screen. And I can show you that if I plotted one of those as a graph, you can see, there it is. You can see that they have an intersection at -1, 2, and that should be true for any arithmetic sequence. But the other thing I wanted to show you was the MA News. They have the e-newsletter, and you'll see these 2 problems here that Ed South will put out there. And again, you can use autograph to solve those 2 puzzles really nicely. And I'll just show you that we create 2 points, a polygon from 2 points. We pick the 2 points and we can then measure the angle. And there you can see, I've been practicing my autograph skills recently because, as you know, I'm the maths community lead for LaSalle, and we've had our autograph webinar course, and autograph can be used for lots of different things. So maybe if you want to learn some maths after this conference, you can see their how-to guides and autograph files. And I noticed Chris shared his spiral diagram, which I think was actually partly created in autograph. So thanks, Chris, for that. So that's talking about learning maths. There's some maths for you to go away and learn. We've talked about networking, so sharing ideas. Social media, Twitter, Facebook. It's okay to have a voice, and don't be afraid to share what you create. Always be willing to have a go. There's plenty of people out there that will disagree or agree with you, and that's okay. You need to know that I go to Twitter jail a lot for spamming people's timelines with links and retweeting lots of things. But if everyone can share at least one idea from today, hopefully that's going to be 1,000 ideas that or more that can go out into the maths community. So just bids me to say thank you for listening to me talk this morning. I know it's hard work for some of you to not have to give me raffle ticket money at a conference, but there are no sweets either. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Flavia.
Thank you, Rob. That was great. Very good. And everybody, since Rob said that, just please do take your ideas and your comments to Twitter and use the hashtag SenecaCPD so that everybody can see each other's ideas. We're going to have a 6-minute break now, a comfort break or a cup of tea break. So please come back at 10. So at 10:05, Emma Bell will start her keynote speak. So please be back by then. All right, see you soon. Robert, can you stop sharing your screen, please? Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Hi, Emma.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm all right. I'm just sorting myself out. Is that shared okay?
Yeah, we can see that. That's great.
Awesome.
All right, so yeah, just I think we can start. Just wait like maybe 30 seconds for people
Yep, no
to
worries.
get ready. So we're about to start our second keynote talk of the day, and that's by Emma Bell. The schedule is on that link that's being shared. I'll share it again. I did mess up the short talks a little bit, so we swapped Gemma with Lisa. So Lisa will be coming after Emma instead of before Emma. Sorry about that. Great, Emma? Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello there, everybody. This is the keynote speak of Maths is My Superpower. It's a bit of a self-indulgent rant about why maths is important, so please bear with me throughout this. But just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm L Tombre on Twitter, and the hashtag that we're using today is Seneca CPD. So if you'd like to ask me any questions or anything, please do so through Twitter and I'll be happy to answer them. I've been a teacher for 20 years now. I started in secondary education, and in about 2013, I moved to FE. So now I specialise in FE maths, so that's further education. I work at the Grimsby Institute in the UK. It's in the north of the UK, in a bit of a cul-de-sac of the country, an area of social deprivation. And I am the maths enhancement manager there. So that means that my job is basically to enhance the experience of maths for both students and teachers and staff at Grimsby Institute. I also lead up the C4Me Centre, so the Centre for Maths Excellence, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And my focuses are the Focus 15, which I will also mention in a minute, and student motivation. I'm really interested in what motivates students, and in particular GCSE resit students who have come to further education, but still have to sit a GCSE. Now, everything that I'm going to talk about today, I popped on a Padlet for you, and hopefully my colleague Lee McLaughlin is going to pop the link to in the chat now. So I've put some further reading on here. There's a PDF version of the PowerPoint on there as well. So anything that I mention should be on there, and you can get it anytime you like. Okay, so this is that perennial question, that perpetual question that comes up all the time. What's the point? What's the point in doing this maths? When will I ever need this? When will I ever use trigonometry in real life? When will I ever use Pythagoras? When will I ever solve simultaneous equations in real life? And I think that the answer to this question is the title of my speech. Maths is my superpower. That's the point. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Okay, so a little bit of background. We learn maths because it's useful. We learn maths because it enables us to understand and critique the world around us. It's quantitative literacy or numeracy. We can understand and critique the world around us because we know about numbers, and we know how numbers work and interact with each other, how data works and how data interacts with everything that we do. As leader of the Centre for Excellence in Maths at Grimsby Institute, one of the things that we're looking into is what maths is important for living, what skills for life are needed by our students. So I know there's a lot of people from around the country, a lot of different sectors, even international. So I'll just explain a little bit of the background here. In 2011, there was something called the Wolf Report. And the Wolf Report recommended that if a student left secondary education without a qualification in maths or English and moved on to college, they would still have to take that secondary qualification, the GCSE, while they were studying for their vocation or their A-levels. Now, this meant that there's a cohort of students going through further education who are taking that general certificate in secondary education for maths. they've had maths for the entirety of their school career. And yet we're asking them to do it again to get that magic grade that gives them a pass. As part of that, what my centre have been looking into is something called the Focused 15. Now, the Focused 15 is a set of 15 topics that we are focusing on with our research students in the hope that it will not only give them enough skills to pass the GCSE exam, but also give them skills for life, skills that they will need outside the classroom to be able to understand and critique the world. We chose these 15 topics by looking at over 1 million pieces of exam data from Graham's Draws on the Maths Emporium of Pearson Edexcel. And we were able to see from all of that data what a grade 4 student can understand in mathematics that a grade 3, a grade 2 or a grade 1 student can't. And it fell out as these 15 topics, these 15 key topics that if you nail them, if you master these topics, you will have enough marks to get a grade 4 or a grade 5 even. But you'll also have skills that you can take forward to understand and critique the world. We've been working a lot on the sequencing of these topics at the moment. But underpinning all of this is the thought that maths is my superpower, and that is why we're learning these topics, we're taking these topics forward, we're giving them tools to be able to understand and critique the world. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is I'm just going to scratch the surface a little bit and show you some maths from around the world where having maths as a superpower helps you to do that understanding and critiquing. So we'll start with health. And what I thought I would do is I would look at food packaging from around the country, around the world. And the information that's put on food packaging, that without my superpower of maths, it could be very, very confusing. So this is from a website called igd.com. I've included it on the Padlet, so there is a link there. And if I bring up a food package label from the UK, so here we have a lot of data. We've got traffic lighting here to show us whether certain nutrients within the food are high, low or medium. But if we look at it, there's a lot of stuff going on here. We've got percentages, we've got kilojoules, we've got calories, we've got serving sizes. There is a lot there to take on. I think that the traffic lights help, because obviously you can see that there is a high amount of sugar here. But what we need to be able to do is compare it to other foods, not just look at one food and decide, no, this hasn't got the positive nutrients that I'm looking for. In the same way, this is the European version of the same thing. I found it interesting that they're using a comma for the decimal point. That was lovely. But what we've also got here is we're looking at not a serving, but per 25 grams as a portion of that 100 grams for the calories. I much prefer this one. And this is the Australian one. If we look at the Australian, it looks very similar. It's got that lozenge format that seems to pervade everything. But what we've also got here is we've got positive nutrients. So we're looking at the dietary fibre. We're looking at not just the negatives, but we're looking at the positives. I also really like the health star rating, that 4-star rating that shows you immediately, by using maths as my superpower, I know that something with a 4-star health rating is a decent choice for my food. So just looking at this, I need, when I'm feeding my family, feeding myself, looking at nutrients, looking at my health with food, I need my math superpower to understand everything that's on those labels. Now, I couldn't go through a talk on math superpowers without talking about COVID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a lot of the data that's around in the world to do with COVID-19 at the moment, and just talk about the maths and maybe some of the misconceptions that are around because of these graphs. Now, a lot of these graphs are going to come from the UK, but I have included some international ones as well. So we'll start with this one. This one is, this was from March. This is all about flattening that epidemic curve. We've got two axes. We've got time and cases. Well, one of the main misconceptions when people saw this was that they thought that the delaying measure, the measures for reducing would actually reduce the number of cases that would happen. What the message that needed to be got across was the fact that it would be the same amount, but just longer. And it was all about that NHS and health system capacity to be able to deal with the epidemic as it was happening. I think in a later version of this graph, they actually put a line parallel to the x-axis to show what the capacity of the health system was, so that you could see that if the measures such as washing hands and things like that weren't used, we would absolutely outstrip the NHS and the health system. But with the delay measure, we would stay below it. And luckily in the UK, that has happened so far. Now, this graphic from New Zealand, it's from the spin-off in New Zealand, perfectly demonstrates about social distancing and things like that. And I really, really like the maths that's within this about if we just stop the spread in certain ways, we're able to stop the number of people. I think that a lot of people during this crisis have gained more of an appreciation of what exponential growth is and how just things can spread so quickly. So I really like this graphic and I wanted to share that with you. There were some dubious graphs that came up during press conferences in the UK, and I'm just going to go through a few of them now. This one was from the 10th of May, and this was the first time that the government in the UK talked about the measures that we would be taking as we eased lockdown. There are lots and lots and lots of things wrong with this graph. I think if we try and analyse it as a graph, it doesn't work. So I can see what the government were trying to do here. I can see that they're trying to represent, look, we've got this, and as soon as the R rate starts coming down, we can start relaxing things. But mathematically, this is really confusing. For instance, we've got the R equals 1 there. What was it before that point? Obviously, it was above 1 because we've talked about the R rate and the infection rate and the number of people that are infected as time goes on. I think actually this graph has been removed because it was so confusing, and it's actually been replaced with this one. They did some work on looking at R being more than 1 in the red area, and then, I mean, it's still interesting. We don't know what the x-axis is representing, but because it's a beautiful graphic, I think that's what the government were trying to do, trying to represent things with a graphic that would be easier to understand. In the same way, this came up in the same press conference. And again, I can see exactly what the government are trying to do. They're trying to show that the COVID alert level, the Nando's ratings of 1 to 5, are impacted by the rate of infection and the number of infections in the country. But writing it as an equation such as this doesn't make mathematical sense. And I think that without using maths as my superpower, again, that's really, really confusing. I've used my superpower to understand it, but if I didn't, that actually wouldn't make sense. So if the number of infections and the COVID alert level was 5 and the rate of infection was 1, then the number of infections would be 4. And just putting those things together doesn't really compute. As a team, what we did with our maths was we tried to get students to use their superpowers to look at what 2 meters actually was. So one of the tasks that we set them while they were doing their remote learning was to show us photographs of what 2 meters actually was, because our students were surprised at actually how far that 2 meter social distancing was. So we tried to include that and try to encourage the superpowers in the students. This is a slide of what is given out in the Australian government, and this is from 2 days ago. There is a lot of data here, a lot of data. But what is wonderful about the way the Australian government are doing this is they are using the same infographic every day. So we've got the current status, we've got the number of reported cases, we've got it split by territories within Australia. And only the numbers change. So you can make that comparison one day to the next. You can see how the virus is spreading, how it's slowing down. I really like the way the Australian government have done this. I think it's very, very clear, but I still need my superpowers to be able to understand exactly what's going on every piece of paper and on every version of the infographic. So the superpowers, even by making something a little bit more easy to understand, I still need my superpowers to go through them. Now, another area of superpowers that are needed are when we're shopping. And I was scrolling through TikTok, as you do, the other day, and came up in my For You page some supermarket hacks, and I want to share one with you now.
Supermarket hack. So Tesco's have put Doritos on for £1. That is a bargain. It's $2.50 for the salsa. You're going to want to pick them up together. Slow down and take a walk to the fajita section, because there are salsa options. For 80p, you can have the Tesco copy. Or if you're a brand snob, you can still have your old El Paso for $1.70. They got options.
I found it really interesting that was called a supermarket hack, that someone has taken the time to make a video that shows people good sense within a supermarket. We need our superpowers in the supermarket to be able to make sure that we are spending our money wisely. I've taken some of these from Concomaths, and this is included on the Padlet. I've included the link here. And these are the kinds of offers that when you're in the supermarket, you end up scratching your head when you're looking at it thinking, this can't make any sense at all. So for instance, here we've got 2 for £3 when actually one would just be less than £1. This one here, very, very similar. And then this one with the refried beans, 3 for £3 or 65p each. We need to have our superpowers and wits about us so that we're not taken in by the flashing signs and the red bits. And this is shown again in this Sainsbury's Wizardry video. That was actually quite
If it's on the end of an aisle, it doesn't mean it's a good deal. 2 packs of Rolos at Sainsbury's were 75p. Go to Iceland, a 4-pack of the same thing, £1. That red sticker doesn't necessarily mean it's a good deal.
So I kind of changed my mind about TikTok videos after that one, because if it is getting the message out that you need to use your superpowers, you need to use your maths to make sure that you're getting a good value deal, then I'm all for it. So I'm going to be sharing those ones later. One of the main areas that I want to look at in the future, and I'm starting to look at now, is the celebration of diversity and social justice within mathematics. Now, there are so many opportunities to give people superpowers to understand and critique the world around them that I think it's a missed opportunity if we don't use them within mathematics to do that. I'm going to show you a quick video now, which underpins some work that my team have been doing. That won't work. Okay, so here we go. So what my team have done, if they've developed some resources for the Education and Training Foundation that look at something that is included within the British curriculum, which is fundamental British values. We found that by reducing Britain to 100 people, we were able to give students a lot of statistics that made the world around them easier to understand and critique. So we've done that for entry level all the way up to level 3. And these resources are included on the Padlet. We thought it was absolutely vital that giving students the superpower to understand the world around them and critique them was so important, especially with social justice. In the same way, we've looked at general elections and things like that, showing students the data that's going on around in the world, all around them, and making sure that within lessons, we're giving them the superpowers to be able to understand and critique them and make an informed decision. Another resource that I want to share with you now is from Catherine Van Saarlos. She's put together a Padlet of resources, which I've included on my Padlet, of all different websites which look at different social justice that can be drawn within maths. Now, this is specifically for level 3 maths, but you can see there's a lot of data and a lot of things here that you could transfer to different age groups. And then finally, thinking about pure maths. Now, I've talked a lot about applied maths and talked a lot about the maths that turns up in supermarkets and things like that. But is there a place for pure maths within our superpowers? This is a bust from a museum in Berlin, and this I actually like the way that this all ties together, because here we've got Seneca and here we've got Socrates. And Socrates said that maths is important not because of the uses that it's got, but what it makes our brain do, what it actually makes us think about abstract things, expanding our brain, giving us the power to be able to critique and understand the world. And the only way that we can understand and critique the world is by going abstract, by thinking about pure maths. I thought that was really interesting, that it gave it that juxtaposition, that it's not just about the maths that we're using in shopping or taxes, it's about the maths that we're doing for the sake of maths. I just thought that was a really interesting counterpoint, and I've put a paper up about that on the Padlet. So what is the point of maths? The point of maths is that maths is my superpower. Maths gives me the ability to understand and critique the world. It gives me the ability to make informed decisions. So whenever I'm asked in class now, what is the point of this? Why am I doing this maths? My answer is maths is your superpower. Maths is your entry to the world. It is your window to be able to understand and critique everything. Here's the Padlet again. I've also included my email address, so if anyone's got any questions or would like to hear anything more about the work that the Centre for Maths Excellence is doing, please feel free to get in touch. And thank you for listening today.
Hi, Emma. Thank you. That was really great videos and like resources in general. That was really, really amazing. Somebody shared the link to the video. I guess that's on YouTube.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
If the word was 100 people, right? Yeah. Great. So we have a few questions for you.
Lovely.
And then everybody else, if you still have questions, just please go for the chat. I'm going to start with the ones that were asked before, but then just please keep writing them. All right. So there were 2 questions that were actually the same, one by Gareth and one by Neil, asking what impact have you seen from using this approach of the 15 topics with students learning?
Students learning. Obviously, we haven't got any exam results this year to be able to back things up. However, we do have a lot of anecdotal and reflection evidence from our students, especially with the wheel. Students really, really liked the fact that the curriculum that they were covering was laid out in front of them. They know exactly what they're covering at each point and what they need to cover as they're going through. There was a little bit of resistance at the beginning because they were coming in to do a GCSE curriculum where they have been taught at school that you need these topics to get certain grades. However, by showing them a paper and showing them where all the marks come from in the paper and showing them the 15 topics, they could see exactly what they could tackle within the paper. So student wise, they like the Focus 15. They like the fact that we have filtered things for them, that we've cut away the chaff, basically, that we have shown them, if you get these things mastered, you can pass.
Yeah, that sounds good. And following up from there, you said there was some resistance in the beginning from the students. Are there any resistance from teachers, well, the other teachers, your colleagues, into using that approach?
No, not at all. My colleagues have always thought that trying to fit the whole of the GCSE curriculum into 6 months of teaching, which is what happens in further education when we're doing resit, it was an impossible task. So they'd be jumping from one topic very, very quickly to the other to try and hit every criteria. But by using the Focus 15, what we're able to do is we're able to fill gaps in the students' knowledge. So we've got these 15 topics, and what we want to do is expand their knowledge in those 15 so that they've got enough marks to pass and enough maths to live a good life.
Yeah, that sounds very good. Sounds ideal. There was actually a question by somebody else asking, how do you have time to use the approach and still cover the whole GCSE level curriculum? So I guess it is possible. You just said that.
So basically, the way we see the Focus 15 is the way we wish GCSE was in FE. So it is a stripped down curriculum for GCSE resits that gives them all of the skills they need to continue, rather than having a full broad GCSE curriculum.
Yeah. And so you work with further education, but there were some questions here asking if you think that will work with primary kids and secondary education as well, the same 15 topics approach.
Yeah, I think it underpins everything. If we have that core knowledge, I know that in Wales they have 2 different GCSEs. So they have a numeracy one that is very much based like that, and then they have an extension paper. I think that'd be brilliant to be able to do in the rest of the UK as well. Sounds
good. So Josh and Kate, I think, just asked, what's the time scale for implementing the Focus 15? So if they want to start with next year, how long does it take to get that set?
If you pop on my Padlet, everything's there that you need. So if we have got everything sequenced, we're also writing a book that covers teaching and learning of the 15 topics. So if you pop on and have a look, go for it.
Yeah, okay, that sounds very convenient. So very easy for everybody else to try in their schools. So there was a question asking Emma regarding the GCSE receipts. Do you also get pupils to do any entry-level functional maths qualifications to build confidence? I'm just reading that out loud.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Well, yes, what we're looking at next year is our students that would be functional skills or entry are actually going to focus on the first 2 parts of the Focus 15, and we're going to put them in for a GCSE, because we're looking at giving students a measure of progress. So if they're coming to us with a grade 1 or a U and we can manage to get them a 1 or a 2, that is good for them. That is showing them that they've got progress. So that is the tack that we're going to be taking next year, focusing in on basically Focus 1 and Focus 2, which is all about number and applying algebra to number and showing that things work in the same way.
Okay, good. Question from Matt. I don't know much about that, but how similar is the Focus 15 to the Just Maths crossover curriculum?
All right, the Just Maths crossover curriculum, I think, covers a lot more of the, well, it does. It covers the crossover questions between the foundation and the higher papers. With the Focus 15, what we're looking at is more underpinning skills. So looking at, can they actually do their times tables and things like that? Because we've got a lot less time, we need to make sure that they can work with fractions and work with times tables and stuff. So the Just Maths crossover is brilliant for those borderline students. What we need to do is get our resits up to that level.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sounds good. And on the 15 topics, do you spend, there's a question from Eunice, do you spend equal time on each topic of the 15?
Not
do you
at
divide
all.
your semester?
Yes, so what we're looking into with me and my colleagues is we've tried to make it as elastic as possible. So if we've got a class with students that are really, really struggling on a topic, we will elongate that. So we will spend longer on it to make sure that they master it. But then if perhaps we've got a class of business students who percentages aren't a problem for, we can shrink it and we can spend less time on that. So it's giving the teachers the freedom to be able to stretch and shrink according to the students that are in front of them.
Yep, so it's not like a defined amount of time for each. It really depends on
the only defined time is the amount of time that we've got with them. So yeah, in a normal year it would be about 30 weeks. Okay,
great. And Mohan just asked here if that works for all exam boards.
Yes. Oh yes. So that's a really good question. When we originally wrote it, we did write it with Edexcel Pearson in mind. But then as we were examining other exam boards, what we did was we got the papers and we tested it. Me and my colleague Lee, who's also around somewhere, went through every paper and made sure that it worked. And what was lovely is that maths is maths. It shouldn't matter what the exam board is. Maths just pervades everything. So
yeah, I like that. Good. So just moving on from another topic now. When you were talking about social justice, somebody asked about fake news. If you cover that, how can Math Superpower help students identify and then not believe in fake news?
Yeah, and it is. It's very much. I resisted putting up some graphs from Fox News because some of their graphs are really quite interesting if you want to Google some of those. But by giving students a superpower to, like I kept repeating that, understand and critique the world, they can look at fake news and make that decision for themselves. So instead of retweeting something straight away, instead of sharing something on Facebook because it, just look behind it, look for things for yourself. Give students that ability to question everything. And I think by using maths as a superpower, we can do that.
Yep, sounds great. Letitia asked if you think students can pass the GCSE receipts or the normal exam without knowing their times table.
I think knowing's an interesting point. It's can they remember it or can they work it out on the page? So I think if a student is able to work it out on the page rather than know it, I think that's important.
Yep. And if you take the Focus 15 to a secondary school or GCSE level, do you think it can be used for students who are aiming for higher grades, so 6 and 9s? 6 to 9s as well.
It's been written with 4 and 5 in mind, but next year what we're doing at college is we're also having a class of students who want to improve their grade. So even if they have passed, they want to, for university reasons or for career reasons, go beyond that. So we're going to use the Focus 15 as a basis, but spend less time on it and then extend from there with the higher topics.
Yeah, that sounds great. We have 1 minute left. So a lot of people asking, can you share again how to get your Padlet, please?
Yes, and I'll pop it up on my Twitter as well. Lee,
yeah,
if you could pop that on again for me.
Chat, yeah.
That'd be lovely.
Yeah. And that was a really, really great talk visually as well.
Thank
really
you.
Nice slides. Yeah. Have you done that? Have you posted it on the chat?
We will do.
Okay.
There we go. Lee's popped it up for everyone. Thanks, Lee.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much, Emma.
No, thank you.
That's
thank
really,
you
really great. Before we move on, I want to tell everybody that we are on number 20 on UK trending topics. I know it's hard to compete with the pubs reopening day. I don't think any other hashtag is going to beat that one, but it would be great if we can do top 10 like we did with the other conferences over the other subjects. We managed to get to top 10. So if you keep using hashtag Seneca CPD, then we can definitely get there. So please keep tweeting and using hashtag Seneca CPD. So now we are going to Gemma frozen. Can you still? Okay, there's. We're going for the second round of short talks, and we are starting with Lisa. Lisa, are you there? Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Okay.
Hi, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Let me just hopefully share my screen. There we go. Okay, hi everyone, I'm Lisa. I currently work for Mathematics Mastery, and I am a primary practitioner. So I'm going to attempt in 5 minutes to talk about fractions from reception to year 6-ish, and share some sort of key thoughts and ideas from myself and from other people. So there we go. So when we start out talking about fractions in reception, EYFS and year 1, it's really important to think about the language that we're using. So it's quite typical for teachers to hold up something like the image here and talk about this is half, or show me half, or give me half, without actually referring to anything. And now the problem with this is that students will come to think of this as half. However, if this is the whole, then that image does not show half, it shows a quarter. And so one of the key things we need to make sure that we're doing is referring to that whole all of the time. So we're saying this is half of one apple, this is half of one sandwich, and so on and so forth. So the first point to really kind of get across to primary practitioners is that fractions of quantities or areas are really dependent on the whole. So this is half of one apple, and it's not half of a bag of apples. Now this idea came from Mike Askew, so I was lucky enough to hear Mike Askew talk, and he was saying that actually he was getting year 1 pupils, when he was showing them things like half of an apple and asking what it was, their immediate response was, well, what's the whole, what are we comparing it to? And so I think that's something that we really need to focus on when we're thinking about fractions in primary. So thinking about what exactly is a fraction. Now I know that I've got lots of secondary people in the conversation today, and so please don't tell me off for anything like this. But in primary, we generally speak of fractions in these 4 ways. So recognizing that it can be part of a whole, part of it can be a number, it can be a result of division, and it can be part of a set. And what I find really, really interesting is that often in primary, when you look at textbooks or materials and so on and so forth, that we often focus on part of a whole and part of a set, and don't really think about the other 2 options. So I'm going to go through some of the number stuff in a minute that I think could be really useful for primary. So thinking about a whole and a set, again, we tend to use the same representation. So you can see my image of pizza there, and that's mostly to remind me to talk about the fact we often associate fractions with food. We talk about circular things a lot, and it's really important for future understanding to really think about it in different ways. It was really interesting listening to the Maths is My Superpower that's just come before, because actually if we can get people to think about fractions in different ways, then they can interact with the world in different ways as well. So one of the ways in which we can do that in primary is to make the link of fractions as a number. So I might present pupils with this particular bar model, thinking about, well, what does this show? So I can see here that I have 1 + 3 is equal to 4, or 1 1 + 3 1s is equal to 4 1s. We can then do this and talk about, well, what does this show? And we have 10 + 30 is equal to 40, or 1 10 + 3 10s is equal to 4 10s. So when we start to think about fractions, we can say, well, okay, what does this show us? And we can then think about the fact that, well, 1/4 + 3/4 must make 4 quarters. And doing it in this way supports pupils to understand fractions as a number, but also that they're not scary. Pupils in primary can really see fractions as something scary and worrying, but actually it's really important that they identify that a fraction is a unit, like ones or tens or hundreds or whatever it is. And so therefore we can start to generalize and think about, well, 1 of a unit + 3 of a unit is 4 of that unit. And we can apply that to anything, 1 apple + 3 apples is 4 apples, and so on and so forth. And we can do lots and lots of variation, lots of examples to get pupils to understand that fractions are just a number. But then we have problems where we think of things like this. So here we have quarters and fifths. They're not the same units, so we can't just assume. Gatenio talks about this much better than I can, and he talks about the fact that when we're thinking about representing fractions in the same way, he talks about apples and pears and how you can't add apples and pears without changing it. We have fruit. And so we need to think about ways in which we can support this. And, you know, in primary, we're often guilty of teaching tricks. So thinking about, we might look for the common denominator here. We might talk about using a wigwam or a butterfly and doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things. But I just want to touch upon the idea that actually we can think about Duval. So Duval talks about treatments and conversions. And if I had more time, I'd go into a lot more detail of what he's talking about. But essentially, as experts, thinking about what David said first thing this morning, we can think about 3/4 plus a fifth actually in a different way. So I would automatically think about it as 0.75 plus 0.2. And that gives me a much easier way to calculate and to think about it without having to mess around with common denominators. And so we need to really emphasize and get children to be flexible in their approaches when we're thinking about fractions. Finally, we can also apply this to thinking about multiplying with fractions, which happens in year 6. We have to multiply 2 fractions. And again, we can be guilty of teaching tricks, times the tops, times the bottoms, ta-da, you have an answer. Now, while that's really efficient, and actually it's what I do in my head, it's not necessarily what we should be teaching pupils without that understanding. But again, if we can think about the multiplication of decimals, we can then manipulate those decimals. So I know that 7.5 times 2 is 15. I know that that is 100 times greater than what I need, so it's 0.15, and I can easily convert between decimals and fractions. So we need to make sure we're making those links consistently through primary. And in summary, we need to make sure that we're considering the value of the whole whenever we are talking about fractions in primary. We need to help children make sense of fractions. We need to make sure we're giving opportunities for pupils to see fractions in lots of different ways. We don't want them to be just thinking about them as these strange things with a line in between. We need to make links so that they're not scary to pupils. And we need to develop flexibility in their representation so that they can do these treatments and conversions to be able to calculate successfully. So I've no idea what time I'm on, but that is me finished, and I hope it was useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. It was definitely useful. It's good to see some primary focus as well on the conferences. That was great. Next one is Daniel. Hello.
I think hopefully you can hear me.
I can hear you. I can see the screen. Yeah.
Excellent stuff.
Yeah. I can't see you. So if you want to switch your camera on.
Yeah. Well, actually, the reason why I've not switched the camera on is because we just moved house yesterday, and I've got just a load of boxes behind me. I can do so just so people can see that.
Up to you. Yeah, that's good. I think that's good.
Can you see me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I'll hold my laptop up a little bit as well. I'm just sat on the floor right now in the new apartment.
No problem.
But I'm really excited to present just a possible something interesting regarding increasing pedagogical content knowledge at a quicker rate. So I'm calling this new kind of idea a pedagogy prompt, and I'm going to talk very quickly about what they are and why they might be useful. So hopefully you can see this question okay. I'm just going to...
yeah, we can see it.
A way to fast track expertise. Of course, expertise comes in kind of lots of different forms. And so whether we can fast track every... and whether the thing that I'm presenting is going to be able to fast track expertise is also difficult to know. But what I essentially want to focus on, like I said, knowledge and to a larger extent, I want to take you back a few years. This is not me at the start of year 7. This is here with a huge bag. This is me in my first year of teaching. Basically, just dragging along a huge bag full of. That's mainly. Hello. Sorry.
Maybe switch off the camera again because your sound is a bit off. So maybe
okay,
with
no
less
problem.
data. Then we can the sound.
Let me see how I just need to see how I can actually stop video.
Yeah. Okay. Let's try.
So this is me carrying a huge load of textbooks, essentially because whilst my subject knowledge wasn't too bad, my PCK was I think pretty. And even though I kind of pored over lots of different journals like ATM and in the evenings and things. And also back then there were only kind of two websites ideas, which provided excellent prompts in a way for thinking, but there wasn't a huge amount. So essentially I did, it was kind of, I think, quite a big issue in that from a personal perspective, even though I was kind of increasing my PC, I think I was very much learning in isolation. Nowadays, Twitter's a little bit different to what it was, and so Twitter's kind of just incredible for class. But then there's a more general issue surrounding that. There's only quite a small proportion of educators. Certainly in all the departments I've worked in 6 departments, nearly 40 people. I'm the only person that's ever actually been on Twitter. So we've got a big issue there in terms of increasing your pedagogical content knowledge can certainly happen on Twitter and through the blogosphere, but it doesn't necessarily happen for. That's why I want to present this is the logo that I've just kind of designed for it. And so what is a pedagogy prompt? Well, I hope that it's a way to prompt positive critical discussion maybe in a department meeting. So here, for example, there is a prompt in terms of the area formula, half A, B, sin, C. And I've kind of got a few hinge questions that come with the prompt. The first hinge question was, which question would you start with if you were starting? And then following that, what would be your sequence after? Post a prompt and then also.
Dan, sorry, the sound is still really off. We're kind of losing about 70% of what you're saying. You're just going mute.
Really?
I don't know if it's the place where you are at the house.
I'll try and I'll try and kind of see if I can move a little bit, and maybe that will increase the Wi-Fi.
I don't know, get closer to the internet.
Yes,
thingy.
of course, yeah. Is that any better?
Seems like it.
Okay, great stuff. So
yeah, great.
I'm most of the way through now, so hopefully you can still it will still all make sense. But this, like I said, this is a possible pedagogy prompt with some hinge questions, possibly for a department meeting, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or maybe even longer. Here's another one, something that I posted once again on Twitter a few weeks ago, and obviously pretty possible kind of representations as such of cosine rule. The third one being one that I kind of just developed myself for a low attainment group, but kind of prompting discussion on different forms of a formula or a representation or a model, I think. And then of course, you know, if you want to then as a department or just for yourself, I mean, they can be used independently, of course. If you want to then use those hinge questions to further, then of course you can do so, but you could just start with a prompt and not use the hinge. Here's a different style of prompt, one that I'll be posting just in very soon. I've now written 50 prompts, so you've just 3 of them today very quickly, but I will be posting them a few a week. This particular prompt, I imagine very much in an apartment meeting that different people would look at different, maybe cell 1 or cell 4, and think a little bit about how they might utilize that in their teaching. Maybe cell 1, for example, would provide a hook, a starting hook into Pythagoras' theorem. Maybe not, but it'd be an interesting kind of thing to discuss. The reason that I kind of came up with this is being in SLT for quite a number of years. I realized that when we had a draft of something to discuss, often our discussions were much more rich, and then we took them off on tangents after that. But when you have a draft of something, when you have a prompt, then I think that it kind of catalyzes thinking in a certain way, and then takes it off into really interesting perspectives after that. You kind of move on from the prompt. So, and there would be the hinge question for that one. So I'm going to be publishing a website today. It's called Dan. I wish I hadn't called it that. I did that a few weeks ago when I was exhausted looking after a 5-month-old. But anyway, it's got different parts. It's going to have different parts of the website, but pedagogy prompts is going to be one part of it. Surprising that I presented on a few weeks ago, the Virtual Maths Conf, will also be in there as well. Looking forward to publishing that today. And so you will be able to find pedagogy prompts on there. If your department is not one that holds pedagogical discussions in meetings, and of course that happens, admin gets in the way, I'm kind of hoping to post, let's say, once or twice a week on Twitter, maybe at a specific date and time as well, so that kind of, maybe you could come on and have. I'm going to leave things there. I apologize if I've gone over a little bit, but a little bit of a manic time. Thank you so much.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Daniel. And yeah, people will get in touch with you on Twitter to get the links to the new website. Looks
yes,
good.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Gabriella, you're up.
Hello, thank you.
Hi.
If Dan could stop sharing his screen, then I'll be able to share.
Of course, yeah.
Thank you.
Just kind of looking to see how I do that. Sorry.
I think there should be a red button.
Oh, yeah. Stop sharing. Thank you very much. Sorry about that.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, here we go. Hopefully you can see my slides here. Hello everyone, my name's Gabriella Veglio and I'm head of maths in a secondary school in Kingston. I've been back at school teaching maths lessons to our year 10s for 2 weeks now, and so I'm just going to reflect on some of the teaching and learning strategies that we're using as more and more pupils return to us at school. So there's many different areas I would love to talk about today, and I'll be spending time developing these with my team. But today I've selected these 4 areas that are highlighted to touch on in this short time that we have. Something that we've established in my department is a routine of 5 quick questions at the start of every lesson. So we've always done this, but at the moment I'm particularly conscious that this frequent retrieval practice has been missed by pupils over the lockdown period. And because as well as monitoring the success of the remote learning content when they come back, we also want to make sure that pupils are still remembering the content that we taught them back in January, February, March, and before that, of course. On the left of the screen, you can see an example of a Year 7 5 quick question starter. But on the right, you can see our spaced retrieval schedule as a spreadsheet. So we use this to ensure that we're regularly interrupting that forgetting curve for each topic. I'm happy to share this spreadsheet after the conference, but it's really easy to make, where you only need to input your list of topics that you cover each week down column A, and then that's it. The colourful columns fill up automatically so that each topic appears 2 weeks after teaching, then 1 month after teaching, and then 2 months after. So then it alerts staff as to what topics they should be including as question 1, 2, and 3 of this 5 quick question starter. I then added 2 extra columns, which are yellow and red, and that's just to indicate that question 4 and 5 should be based on just general AFL from the class, and then perhaps a prerequisite skill that would be needed later in the lesson, something like that. Okay, now that we're back in school, it might be that at the moment you're currently teaching a group with a lot more range of ability than usual, depending on how your school normally sets pupils. But the cluster or the bubble that they've been assigned to might mean that's a bit different. So I certainly recommend having a challenge pre-organised, perhaps on their Google Classroom or whatever platform you use to send particular pupils off to if your AFL is now telling you that they're secure and need to move on while others don't. You can see an example on the screen of a challenge I chose from Craig Barton's Maths Ven's website, but lots of people have posted Maths Ven questions online too, which I think are super to encourage some higher level thinking. My penultimate slide is about fun. I think we need to remember that some pupils will have been lonely during the lockdown period, or perhaps, or maybe certainly bored. So I've said to my team that we should make an extra effort to vary the tasks that we're using now in our face-to-face lessons, to make them especially dynamic and for pupils to enjoy their learning again. I've put some examples on the screen of some different types of tasks that we've included with the Year 10 so far. I can't remember who I heard about roast and toast from, probably on Twitter somewhere, but I think it offers a wonderful opportunity to celebrate success in the lesson and keep pupils positive about their learning. The idea is to roast a typical sort of spot the error type question, and then choose a member of the class to hold up their work, and then everyone can toast to particular successes in their work. Because, as I say, we ideally want the children to feel success and be positive about returning to school, but also to inspire them to keep going with their learning at home as well. So my last slide is about AFL, because I think it's going to be probably the most important thing that we build into our teaching now more regularly, or perhaps more formally. We need to find the gaps and misconceptions that have arisen while pupils have been trying to learn at home, but we want to ensure that that is very regular and low stakes so that pupils feel comfortable and not panicked. Our team use a mixture of Socratives and Google quizzes before, during and after a topic, and we're also a big fan of exit tickets. I'm really sorry, I can't remember who shared this plenary bank on Twitter that you can see at the bottom of the screen now, but I'll retweet it after the conference, and it's a great bank of ideas that could be used in any lesson to incorporate some fun assessment at any point in the lesson. So I think I've managed to do that in 5 minutes, and I hope it was just a quick trip that is helpful for you to see how we're re-establishing that face-to-face learning at the moment. And I'd be happy to speak on Twitter about any more aspects in a bit more depth.
That's great. Thank you very much, Gabriella. That was brilliant, and that was exactly 5 minutes, so well done. Amazing. Now we're going to go for a 5-minute break again, and then we get back for the last round of short talks. So see you soon. Okay, hi, welcome back. Now we will have the final round of short talks, followed by our last keynote talk by Joe Morgan. So now the short talks are by Alice, Atul, and Andrew. Alice, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, whenever you're ready. Just want to remind people that on that link that I've been sharing, there is another link to Joe Morgan's free CPD course on Seneca Learning, so you can learn all about her mathematical methods based on her book. She wrote a free CPD course for us, so you can go on the website and check the course for yourselves. All right, so Alice, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so I think you can see my screen. Eventually.
Yes, all good. Yes.
Okay, super. So I'll make a start then. Good morning, everyone. My name's Alice Ward-Gow, and I'm the numeracy coordinator at George Pinder School, which is a secondary school based in Scarborough. For my presentation this morning, I will largely be sharing what we've done for Year 6 transition at our school, the rationale behind it, and other ways this could be further developed. I'm going to begin by talking about what I mean when I say making the unfamiliar familiar. I first heard this at a Trust webinar that I recently watched, and it's stuck with me ever since. When we think about getting Year 6s to visit their secondary school for transition days, this is the main purpose, to give them a level of familiarity that can help them to overcome any worries or anxious feelings that they might have about moving to secondary school. And this really got me thinking whether there was anything else that we, the teachers, could do to support Year 6 transition. Now, you might disagree with my next point, but I strongly believe that transition is everybody's responsibility. It's not just down to those staff who are closely linked with the head of Year 7. Everybody has their part to play, and there are things that we can all do which will contribute to a smooth Year 6 transition. I think it's important to also mention that transition isn't something that only happens during a transition day. It is something that can be an ongoing process for many children. We also need to be mindful that with the current situation, there will be lots of students from other years who will also need our support for their smooth transition back into school. When thinking about what we could do for Year 6s, this year, the natural starting point was to think about, well, what did we do last year? There we go. And see if there was anything from there that we could replicate this year or make some improvements on. Like many schools, we had 2 transition days where the Year 6 students visited school and they got to take part in a range of different activities in lots of different subject areas. They also got a tour of the school and a chance to meet their tutor and other key staff. In addition to this, the maths team also invited Year 5 and Year 6 students from feeder primary schools to visit and take part in some exciting maths activities. This was last year though, when things were a little different to how they are now. As with any other school, we've had to carefully consider what we can and can't offer our Year 6s. If you're on Twitter, then you might have seen or taken part in one of the Tuesday night math chats. A couple of months ago, there was a really interesting discussion on the transition from primary to secondary school, which challenged us to consider what we can do to ensure that this process runs smoothly. One key theme which arose from this and really made me reflect was when someone asked, is there anything from last year that you could do virtually this year? And it was this that inspired me to challenge myself to adapt what we'd done previously. I'll take no credit for my school's virtual tour. I didn't make it or star in it, but what a great way to start to make some of the building familiar to the Year 6s. I've seen lots of schools sharing their virtual tours, and this often includes introducing some of those key members of staff. Now, the tour might also include a range of different subjects, but what we really need is to give students a chance to get familiar with lots of members of staff, and give them the opportunity to take part in some activities from different subjects. One of the things we did last year was we put together an escape room for when the Year 5s and 6s visited us, and this year we have the virtual maths escape room. The activities can be downloaded and then the Year 6s can share their answers with us via a Google form. If you look closely, you can see that we have a couple of teachers there in avatar form. This is a great way to add another level of familiarity, and perfect if you have anyone on your team who might be camera shy. Next up, we have the adapted murder mystery tasks, which are freely available online. We edited them to include staff from the department. We also decided to change it from being a murder mystery to a mystery thief, as we felt that presenting one of our team as a murderer probably wouldn't be the best way to introduce them. We then needed to encourage the rest of the school to join us. And this is what started the subject challenges section of our website. So we got lots of contributions from other teams in school. So we got a detectives page from the science department. The MFL team were pretty thrilled that they worked out how to change the language of their Bitmojis. And you can see for this, we're getting that familiarity. Bitmojis and avatars, they weren't compulsory. But it was great that some subjects decided to include those. Here we have a history quiz, but again, we're giving the students that chance to share with us what it is that they've done. I'm rapidly running out of time, so here's a list of some other ideas, and if you're on Twitter, then you might have seen some of these. There's a really nice Meet the Team booklet that I know lots of people have been downloading, adapting. There's also some really nice calculator resources from MEI. Don't have enough time to go into detail of those, but if you haven't seen them, do check them out. And just my final point really is that we spend a lot of time thinking about transition for year sixes, but do we need to apply some of the same principles when we're thinking about the transition for new staff, in particular NQTs? So I'm going to finish off there. Thanks very much for listening, and if you want to carry on the discussion, you can find me on Twitter.
Yep, thank you, Alice, that was great. Thank you very much. Atul is up next.
Great. I'm not screen sharing, so I'll just go for that. So if you happen to be, you can put me on speaker view if you happen to be on gallery view. Great. So yeah, my name is Atul Rana. I'm an online maths tutor. That's really my identity. I've been teaching online full time for about 4 years. I started teaching in 2012, and I teach a whole range of maths really. I teach everything from skip counting to number bonds to A-level maths, and the thing I'm most passionate about is helping low attaining pupils get them off the conveyor belt and find where their true starting point is, plug any gaps in their knowledge, and see them slowly flourish and start to like maths. That's really the thing I'm really most passionate about. So I've been teaching online well before it was a thing, and the one thing I've been doing all these years is trying to sell the idea to parents. So it's got to work both ways. It's got to work because the teaching is effective, and it's got to work because through the medium I deliver it online. So it's got to work both in the teaching and both in online. And I'm operating in this highly competitive London marketplace, and if I don't get it right, basically this is my livelihood. I don't have a gig. So I've had to really perfect it over the years through thousands of hours of teaching online on how to deliver it. So there's a few mindsets that you need to change when you're thinking about teaching online. First of all, it's eventually you realize it's actually not a bad replication of in person. It's a totally different thing. It's a thing of its own, and I've made remoteness a pedagogical tool in itself. The fact that it's all remote is in itself, you can use that as a really strong and powerful advantage. So I'll just give one example of possibly many reasons why that is. So one thing we can do in maths is use so we have these 4 modalities: concrete, picture, abstract, and language. And perhaps we don't spend long enough between this mapping between language and abstract. So I can ask my tutee to write 2x plus 1 equals 11. So I'm doing that, but they don't need to see me write live all the time, and I don't need to see them live all the time. I'm writing and they're writing, and then I'll get them to articulate back to me what they've written step by step. So that gives me immediate information on where if they maybe what I told them they completely got it, but likelihood they didn't, or they got some of it. So the pupil articulating has 2 really huge benefits. The one is that by getting involved in this articulation, they think they had a thought, they think they were doing something, but the moment they articulate it, it's actually different to what they think they thought about it. And to me, it gives them immediate feedback to actually what their thought process is. In some ways, I can hear their thinking out in real time. And to me, this is a deliberate choice. And actually, this is after a few thousand hours of doing this. When I was switching between online and in person, sometimes I was teaching the same tutee in person and then the other week online, and I found them to be different people online. I was just getting a lot more articulation out of them. So I made this articulation, I tweaked my pedagogy in teaching using this language, mapping between language and abstract. We know we have these questions where they are essentially stories, and perhaps we don't spend long enough to translate these stories into the symbolic meaning, because we as expert maths teachers, we know that it's got to be done in the abstract and symbolic, but there is this language aspect as well. So these days, of course, I use an electronic whiteboard and a whole bunch of other sophisticated tools, so they can see my writing live, I can see their writing live, but I can always choose deliberately to not write live, get them to write live, and then articulate. So this is a really important pedagogical choice. So yeah, that's my main point to make. And basically, there's many other pedagogical tweaks you can make when you're teaching online. You can use a whole bunch of stuff, and it's online teaching is very highly evolved, sophisticated thing. There's a community of online tutors out there already. It's pretty mature. It's about like 5 years old. We've got this 2D canvas. It's a mix of visual design. You can be very careful in the way you're placing your video. You're placing your, you can think about dual coding, which is white space versus just the right information you want them to have. This audio video, you can use virtual manipulatives. You can use Google Earth Pro. You can do virtual tours. You can do a ton of stuff. So that's pretty much it. What I have to say on this. What I'm really doing over the last few weeks and the coming weeks is to actually just demonstrate this live on Twitter, because that's the best way to show it. Actually, it's just to do it. So I've got a couple of videos already using manipulatives and other things. So you can follow me on Atul Rana, same name, just all in one word. So thank you very much for your time.
That's amazing. Thank you very much, Atul. I'm sure people will be asking you for some tips later on Twitter. And our last short talk of the day is by Andrew. You there, Andrew?
Yeah, good morning.
Hello. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Yep, okay. I'll just share my screen. Firstly, thank you, Flavia, for the opportunity. My name's Andrew Woods, and a few years ago, I conducted some research into some assessment models, and I'm just going to share some of my findings with you. If I was to ask you to rank which medal you would want to achieve in a competition, I think I could probably guess your order: gold, silver, bronze. Take these three faces of Olympians. Who do you think won which medal? I find it really surprising, looking at their facial expressions, that it was Michaela, the US gymnast, that got silver, who looked wholly unimpressed, and Maria got bronze, the one with the biggest smile. The Centre for Economic Performance has shown with overwhelming evidence that silver medalists are on average less happy with their performance than bronze medalists. Work coming out of someone called Laurie Santos, who's from Yale University, their happiness lab suggests that we are always identifying success by using a comparative marker. So on the podium, this is the silver medalists making comparisons to the gold medalists, and the bronze medalists, pleased that they got on the podium, but acknowledging that the gold was still a medal away, meant they were more positive about their performance. Within education, we use comparative markers to measure students' performance. Typically, this takes the form of either using criteria referencing or norm referencing, comparing students to each other. However, the lesser spotted ipsative assessment is using a comparative marker from where they were in the past. Let me quickly use the Freya model just to illustrate my point. The focus of ipsative is solely on the individual's progress and to measure that, and encouraging them towards a personal best. This can take many forms of grading, feedback, or measuring progress from what has been learned. Here are some opportunities that I feel ipsative assessment can offer. For low attainers, Dylan William found that criteria reference assessments can have negative effects on motivation, especially low achieving learners who are led to believe they're unable to learn. Hosting high attainers, Andaman found that in a graded environment, there's a greater chance higher achievers turn to cheating. Raising self-efficacy, McIntyre's iterative assessment program have demonstrated the positive effects on students' beliefs in themselves. Stobart found that it also increased intrinsic motivation by moving away from a criteria-orientated goal. And it also improves formative feedback. An overemphasis on summative assessments leads to an overemphasis on how well learners are doing, leading to learners being less engaged with what they're doing. I do feel that the use of ipsative assessment could prove to be very effective for all learners. It does sound very attractive. However, there are a number of constraints. I believe that this is very much contrary to how society functions and how the education system is set up. It does fly in the face of the status quo. Instagram and social media pry on this comparative marker and are evidently have effects on mental health for our students. It's been shown that society will always default to comparative markers that are the harshest towards ourselves. This is what our students will be feeling each time they receive summative judgments. And I don't believe that anyone wins in this situation. I feel the biggest constraint, however, is the resistance to be expected from students, parents, and leaders in the schools. Should we argue that it is in their best interest not to know until the time is right and focus on progress instead? I think research supports that a better method of assessing is to use personal markers in time to build students' motivation and ultimately to build happy students. However, I do recognise that summative judgments are necessary. It's how we know cohorts are improving, and it is a vital part of our everyday practice. However, maybe monitoring closely more what is seen and unseen might help. So William indicates that as soon as a judgment, summative judgment is made, then the learning stops, and we don't want that. It is therefore the frequency of this that could be carefully considered, and we should take care. Yale University have found that these bad comparative markers can cut our life short. So my plug, or what I'm advocating, is to help students both in their happiness and in their progress by using more ipsative interpretations. Thank you for listening. There's the references.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you. That was really great. Thank you so much. Can you repeat your Twitter handle, please, so people can get in touch with you?
Yeah, sure. It's at Mr. Woods Maths with underscores in between them.
Okay, brilliant. So now we're going to go for our last keynote talk, which is by Joe Morgan. And I just want to remind everybody. Joe, you there?
Yes, hello.
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody before she starts that she has written a free CPD course for Seneca. So if you go on the link that I've been sharing, I'm going to share it again. You can take a whole free CPD course written by Joe based on her book on mathematical methods, and it's great. And you even get a certificate, and it's all free. So please, great way to spend your Saturday afternoon or maybe tomorrow morning is to take Joe's CPD course. And Joe, you can start. I don't know if I can see you. Hang on.
Can you? Oh, have you got? You should be able to see. Can you see my slides and can you see me?
I see your slides.
Not see me. Oh.
Hang on.
My video's on. That's right.
Okay. Now you. Yeah. Now you go.
Great.
Okay. Good.
Okay. Lovely. Well, thank you very much for having me here, and thank you to those of you who have stayed for the last talk of the day. I am going to attempt to do a very quick topics in-depth presentation. For those of you who aren't familiar with this series of talks that I do, I am modelling what I think Maths Department CPD should look like. So I'm saying if you're all teaching the same topic next week, you should get together as a department and talk about that topic in depth. Okay, and I'm modelling that today with an example, and the example I've chosen is lowest common multiple. So this works for any topic at all, and I'm trying to get across the idea of this is what maths teachers should talk about when they're preparing to teach. Have a think about what it means for a teacher to really know a topic in depth. We all know some teachers make the mistake of saying, well, I have a maths degree, therefore I know enough to teach it. And if you're experienced, you'll know that's not true at all. Just knowing having the subject knowledge is not enough to know how to teach a topic well. Some of the things that I think teachers need to know are, first of all, the curriculum. I am guilty of teaching year 7 having not looked at the primary curriculum, and that's not okay. We need to know the curriculum in primary, secondary, we need to know where the topic goes at university, we need to know the links to other subjects and all of that stuff. We need to know our curriculum inside out. We need to know for the topic we're going to teach, what are the good examples, what are the non-examples, what are the boundary examples, how we're going to do our explanations, are we going to use visualizations, all the different things that we could consider there. We need to know that stuff through and through before we start teaching a topic. How are we going to assess? What hinge questions can we use? But also, how is the topic assessed in summative assessment? So how does this topic look in GCSE exams or in year 6 SATs exams or in A-level? That's all the stuff that we need to know before we teach a topic. What are the common misconceptions? What are our students likely to do wrong? What tasks can we use? What resources are really good for this topic? What are the key words? What's the etymology and the history of those words? What are the things that are going to, our students, or maybe our EAL students, are going to find tricky in this topic? What is how can we enrich the topic? Where's the narrative? Where's the stories we can tell? And what methods are there? Are there lots of different methods for this particular topic? And what do our colleagues use? And what will our students have seen before? So there's probably more here, but in general, in order to know a topic, any topic well, before we start teaching it, we need to know all of this stuff. And that's hard to do because we don't have the time in general to develop our subject knowledge in this way. But this is the stuff I'm going to talk to you about today. I can't cover everything here, but I'll do my best to get through a lot of this for lowest common multiple. So let's start by looking at curriculum. And I just want you to have a think. If you're a teacher from England, so we're looking at the English curriculum here, do you know when lowest common multiple is first introduced? Because I admit to not knowing this before I did some research for this presentation. If we look at the primary curriculum and we look at year 6, it mentions common multiples. Okay, so it talks about finding the common multiples of 2 numbers. So it might say lists the common multiples of 3 and 8, obviously up to a point. It doesn't say anything about lowest common multiple, and that's really interesting because I think I have often taught this to year 7s where some of them have been familiar with the idea of lowest common multiple because obviously they have met it in primary, but it is not specifically listed on the primary curriculum. So it doesn't actually say lowest common multiple there. It just talks about the idea of common multiples. And of course, if we're teaching common multiples, we're bound to mention what's the lowest one, but it's not specifically mentioned. However, what I find more interesting than that is that in year 5, so when children are say 9, 10 years old, they are adding fractions with common denominators. And if you're having to find a lowest common denominator, then actually you're finding a lowest common multiple. So even though it's not specifically mentioned on the primary curriculum, this sort of phrase, lowest common multiple, we know that actually students will have been using the concept when they've worked with fractions, and students definitely will have met the idea of common multiples before. It's actually nice to look at SATs questions. These are questions that students sit in their exams in year 6. So that's when they're 11 years old. And actually there's always some nice questions, and there's always questions I think that are nicer than the style of GCSE questions. And here's a couple of examples. Now, the fact that this is examined all the time in SATs means that we know our students would have seen this before. Have a look at that question. Write all the common multiples of 3 and 8 that are less than 50. Okay, now I think that students would probably do that through a listing method. So they might write out, for example, their 8 times table up to 50, and then they might identify which of those are multiples of 3 or something like that. I really like that second question there. That's from the old SATs, but that's really nice to have that scaffolding of providing that grid. So it's find the smallest number on the chart that's a multiple of 2 and 7. So obviously that's not the lowest common multiple of 2 and 7 because you can only use the numbers on this chart, but that's a really nice visual scaffolding for children, and I think that's a lovely way to present it. I could show you loads more SATs questions on this, but I'll just mention that quite often on SATs, and some of these are from the old SATs before the change to the primary curriculum, but quite often they use Carroll diagrams and Venn diagrams as a way of testing students' understanding of multiples. So we're kind of testing 2 things here. Do they understand how the diagram works and the sorting mechanism? And also, are they familiar with the terminology of multiple? Do they know that word? and do they understand how to find a common multiple? So these Venns and cowl diagrams are a really nice way of looking at this topic and of assessing this topic. Now, when we get to Key Stage 3, suddenly we've got the word lowest common multiple, and it's weird that it's been separated from common multiple. So if we look at the Key Stage 3 curriculum, it says common multiple and it says lowest common multiple, as if they're separate things. And I think that's interesting because to me, that suggests, oh, suddenly we're going to introduce a procedural method. And I think that's really interesting that we've got this this sort of sudden change where we're saying, hey, we're going to sort of maybe stop this listing thing and maybe start looking at procedure. That's not what it's saying, but I think that's almost what's implied here. And I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But another thing that's interesting to note is there is no change on the GCSE specification. The content here is Key Stage 3 content. It is assessed at GCSE, but the content is exactly the same at GCSE and Key Stage 3. So that means that there's nothing new to teach when our students are in year 10 and 11 for this particular set of concepts. But how it's assessed at GCSE looks very different to how it's assessed in SATs. Oh, what a dull question. So this is AQA and there's a very similar one from Edexcel. This is question 5 in a higher tier paper on the new GCSE. And I think you'll probably all agree this is a pretty dull question. It's probably, I expect they're thinking of a very procedural method to answer this question. One thing that I thought was weird when I was researching this is why have they put LCM in brackets? I don't really know why they feel the need to do that because we don't see that in any other topic where they provide an abbreviation. And I find that quite unsurprising. I don't really know why they've written the words lowest common multiple and then written LCM, almost as if they think that some students will see LCM and know the procedure, but see the words lowest common multiple and not know what the question's about. I mean, I wonder if that's what it is, but I don't really get why we've got those letters there. And it kind of worries me because it makes me think that this is all about a procedure. But yeah, this is a typical AQA question on this topic. The numbers are fairly big, which might then dictate the method that we want to use. But let's have a look, have a think what you think, how well you think students did on this. This is question 5 on a higher paper. It's also on the foundation, but let's think about it for higher. Well, actually, it was pretty well answered. I mean, you'd expect that for a question that's early on a higher paper. And it says lots of students gave the correct answer. Some students did a prime factorization and then stopped at that and they got a mark. And that's a bit frustrating to me that they got a mark if they really didn't know what lowest common multiple was or even necessarily knew what the term multiple meant. They still could pick up a mark here. But this bit is probably the most worrying bit in the examiner feedback. A significant number of students gave the highest common factor as their final answer. Now that I think probably makes all of us kind of want to cry a bit because this question is about multiples. We should be getting a number that is greater than 144 here. There's no way this answer should be a factor of one of those two numbers. And giving an answer that's a factor shows that students are thinking about this totally procedurally and they are not at any point understanding what that question is asking them to do. If they're asked for a multiple and they give a factor, there's quite a serious problem there. And it says a significant number of students do that. And I think we probably all know that that's probably down to the fact that they've been taught this in a very procedural way. And they see lowest common multiple and they just sort of have maybe a prime factor tree and a Venn diagram or something like that appears in their head and they get the wrong part of that procedure. So that's a worry. Really similar question on Edexcel. 40 and 56. Hey, I wouldn't really want to list the 56 times table, so perhaps I would do this using a procedure or method, but really similar feedback here. So we have most students got at least 1 mark, normally because they drew some factor trees. So they're looking at this and they're thinking, oh, that's the thing with the factor tree or whatever. And then they do that and they get their mark. It says a large number of students gained 4 marks. So that's great. It was question 2 on a higher paper. So Edexcel knew this would be an accessible question. But again, oh my God, a significant proportion chose the answer 8. And that is worrying. They see the word multiple from a fairly young age. They certainly know that word in year 5 and year 6, and they should see that word all the time throughout secondary school, the word multiple. And to have a question that asks for a multiple and give a 40 and 56 and to give an answer of 8 is really quite upsetting. I'm going to show you one more exam question before we move on to look at methods and teaching and all that sort of thing. So just sticking with assessment just for a minute. I was hoping to see more questions like this when I looked at how does lowest common multiple look on the GCSE. I found a couple of very procedural questions like the two we've just looked at, and I didn't find much like this, which is kind of what I expected to see. This one is from EdXL, and we've got 3 lamps flashing at different intervals, and and the question is not asking when is the first time they flash together. It's really important that we note that. The question's asking how many times in 1 hour will they flash at the same time. So this is not a lowest common multiple question, but it is a question to do with common multiples. Have a think about how you would answer it and how you'd want your students to answer it. And we'll have a look at the examiner feedback. So the most popular approach was writing down multiples, and that actually makes me quite pleased because that shows a bit of understanding about what this question's all about. They wrote down the common multiples and then they figured out when the lamps would flash at the same time. And this is a bit tricky because they're used to answering questions like this, which ask for a lowest common multiple. So the tricky thing here is the question's asking how many times they'll flash together in an hour. And students may have seen a whole load of contextual LCM questions, and they might be really familiar with those, but this is asking for a different thing, and that will have confused some of them. But it's good to see that most students are picking up at least a mark for writing down a few multiples, at least they get the multiple bit there. And it says that some students attempted to do a prime factorization approach here and just got themselves into a mess. So this is another example of where they've been kind of programmed to look at a question like this and think, oh, that's an LCM question. Oh, LCM, that's got a procedure involving primes. And then just going ahead with that when actually we know that probably a listing method, it makes more sense here. You know, it's not the only way we can do it, but students who tried to use primes, they got themselves into a mess. So we can see a problem here of students kind of being pre-programmed to have certain responses when they see certain question types. So that's it on very briefly, because obviously I haven't got much time today. I'd normally do an hour on this, but we're saying that is the curriculum and how the topic is assessed. And now we're going to have a quick look at the history of this topic, some of the methods we can use, and a little bit about pedagogy. Now, this is a very old topic. This has been taught forever. Okay, so if you look back at some of the oldest English language math textbooks, the word least common multiple, not lowest common multiple, but same thing, was found in a 1734 textbook and perhaps earlier than that. So this is something that has been part of our school curriculums for a very long time, even before curriculums existed. And so it is a topic that has been there forever. And a lot of old textbooks had tons of algebra stuff on this, and we don't do quite so much on algebraic lowest common multiple these days, but there were whole chapters in old textbooks on finding the lowest common multiple of polynomials and stuff like that. I would love to show you loads of old textbook stuff right now, and I'm not going to do it because I'll be here all day. But just to show you, this is an extract from a textbook from the early 1900s and a textbook from the 1800s. And you can see a method that will be familiar to some of you and may look new to others. So if you're someone, for example, that uses a Venn method to do your lowest common multiple, then maybe you haven't seen these methods before. That is the method, kind of the method that I now teach. I changed the way I teach this topic a few years ago. But yeah, if you look at that kind of L shape there, that's how I do it. So that's how I find lowest common multiples if the numbers are too big to do it in another way. So if I have to use a procedure because of the size of the numbers, then that's the method I use. Now, I would love to now spend half an hour talking you through various methods, and I just don't have time today because I'm really on a short time limit. So we're gonna look at a few things to do with methods in a minute, but I'm just going to suggest that if you are interested, when I talk about that method I just showed you with the L shape, that's what I call the factor method. And when I talk about the Venn method, some of you might not know what I mean by that because you might not have seen it done with the Venn, but all of this is in my book and there's a whole chapter on it. So I'm sorry because that seems like I'm plugging my book, but the point is that I just don't have time to go through methods in detail now because I would need another hour. But it is all in there if you're interested on all different ways of doing this. Interestingly, this to me is one of the topics that is taught differently the most. So if you look at some things like, let's say multiplication, I reckon most secondary teachers teach a column method for multiplication. Some might teach a grid method, but we know that there's kind of two main ones there. There are other ones that are taught as well, but I know that the column method really is quite dominant. But if you look at highest common factor and lowest common multiple, I don't think there really is a dominant method. I think we're all over the place with this. Sometimes I will use a listing method depending on the question. Sometimes I'll use a factor method. I used to teach a Venn diagram method. I have teachers in the next classroom to me who teach it differently to the way I do it. And that's not ideal, because that means when my students change classes, or if I set my students a homework on Hegarty maths, they're going to maybe see a different method to the one I teach. So it's not ideal to have that inconsistency, but I think this is one of the topics where the inconsistency is huge in the way it's taught over the country. And I don't think there's necessarily a best method. It's an interesting thing to see the different ways people find a lowest common multiple. People don't need to worry that their methods won't get method marks in exams. I mean, you can kind of do these things any way you want, and as long as the examiner marking it will recognise the maths that's going on. AQA do this really helpful thing where they provide very student-friendly past paper analysis. So if you look at this one, this is the question we looked at earlier, lowest common multiple. Again, we've got the LCM in brackets. Both AQA and Edexcel do that. I don't know why. Of 120 and 144. The method they've used in their model answer is actually not one that I think is hugely commonly used. I might be wrong, but I don't think loads of teachers do that method. That method, by the way, is one where you do the prime factorization and the finding the LCM all in one go, rather than separately do the prime factorization and then do the LCM. So this is similar to the one I do. It's kind of everything's done in one go rather than two separate parts to the method. And I'm surprised that they've put that on there, because I didn't think it was that commonly taught, but it's nice to see it there. But if you look at the actual mark scheme for the question, everything is getting credit. So if a student does a prime factorization, they're getting marks. If a student lists multiples, they're getting marks. If a student does basically anything that mathematically is helpful to answer this question, they're going to be getting marks. So it's nice to see that kind of support of a variety of methods from the exam boards. Now, we know there's a big problem in this topic, and the big problem is obviously this confusion between the lowest common multiple and the highest common factor. If the students ask for a lowest common multiple, and that question is all about multiples, and they give a factor for an answer, that is worrying. And we think that comes, or I think that comes from a focus on procedures. So at primary school, they learn all this lovely multiple stuff. They're looking at common multiples, and they're kind of starting to understand this idea. And then they get to secondary school, and perhaps right from year 7, they're being told, here's a procedure for doing these questions. And then they're getting themselves in a mess with it. They're getting confused between these two very closely related topics. So one thing we can do here is that constant emphasis on vocabulary. And I wish this was done younger, because my daughter, who is 6, she could tell you, she could count up in 5s. She could tell you, she could count up in 2s. She's starting to know her times tables, but she doesn't know that she knows the multiples of 5, and she doesn't know she knows the multiples of 2. So she doesn't know that word multiple. My 8-year-old daughter, she knows quite a few of her times tables. So I can say to her, tell me your 4 times table, and she'll tell me. If I say to her, tell me the multiples of 4, she will not know what I mean. And it is quite frustrating that we kind of label these things as times tables, which is an awful term. I don't know where it came from. In old maths textbooks, they call them multiplication tables. And I don't know where the term times table came from, but I wish we could label these things as the multiples of. And that would mean from a very young age, children knew that these are multiples. And instead of calling them times tables, it would just be nice if we use that term consistently. That is not a problem I know how to solve, because that is like a countrywide issue. But yeah, it's interesting that my daughters don't know that word, yet they do know multiples. Separation of concepts. Now, if you look on TES, for example, at lessons on lowest common multiple, they're normally in the same lesson as highest common factor. All of this stuff is being crammed into a single lesson, highest common factor, lowest common multiple method. I'm not sure it should be. I think perhaps we need to separate those things out. I mean, putting all this stuff in one lesson surely is overload. And that brings me on to atomization, which is related. The way that quite a lot of the procedures work for lowest common multiple is that, first of all, students will find the prime factors. So they'll do a prime factor tree or repeated division or whatever they're going to do, and then they'll write out the prime factorization of the number, and then they'll use something else, which might be a Venn or some sort of comparison, and then they find their lowest common multiple. And there's an awful lot going on there. And actually, what's really nice is if you look at some older textbooks and the way they deal with this topic is that when they introduce here's highest common factor, when they introduce finding the highest common factor, they're not asking students to do the prime factorization first. they're giving them the prime factorized form of the number. So if you look at question 1 there, you've got 3 numbers that are presented in as products of primes, and students are being asked to find the highest common factor. So we can really focus on what that means. What does it mean to share factors? We can really focus on that without saying to students, actually, question 1, can you do the prime factor tree, and can you do the prime factor tree for both or all 3 of these numbers, and then we'll look at the highest common factor, because there's so much going on there. So actually separating those 2 separate procedures and saying we're going to start by just really understanding what primes tell us about a number, but I'm not going to put you to all that hassle of finding the primes first. I'm just going to give you the primes. I think that's really helpful. And perhaps choice of method helps, the right choice of method maybe will help students stop confusing LCM and HCF, possibly. And certainly there are visualizations we can use in our teaching that will help. I'm going to show you a couple of visualizations. For example, I mean, it seems so obvious, but I don't think I've ever shown students that if we're looking at common multiples, we can show them on this kind of number grid. And here I've got multiples of 7 and I've got multiples of 5, and I can see that 35 is a common multiple of 5 and 7. So it's that kind of visualization I think is probably really helpful, as well as number lines. You know, there's all sorts of ways we can do this. And as well as bar modeling. So there's kind of all these different ways we can look at what do we mean by the lowest common multiple. And I know that some people watching today will have been to Johnny's workshop on using prime factor tiles to understand what numbers are all about, and to be able to find, for example, multiples and factors of numbers by using prime factor tiles. Now, I can't go through all this again today because I am not the expert on it, and you have to watch Johnny talk about this so you can understand how he approaches things to do with primes. And this is absolutely lovely stuff. So this is what I mean by visualizations, like how can we help students understand what's going on with the visuals or with the tools or manipulatives that we use. So I'm not talking about that today, but I really recommend you go and watch that session by Johnny. Really the last thing I want to talk about though is I want to have a think about, I'm going to show you a few resources at the end very quickly, but I just want to talk about how the way we present the problem makes a huge difference to the way we think about how to do these questions. I'll give you just 5 seconds. Have a look at those questions and think about this. What would you do and what would your students do if presented with a list of questions that looks like this? Now, I'm going to assume you think in the same way as me, which is a ridiculous thing to assume. But with these questions, for the first 3, I just know the answers, and that's just because I am experienced with this kind of thing, and I know what a lowest common multiple is. So I look at the first one, and I know it's 20. And I know the second one's 24, and I know for the third one I might have to think for a second, but I know that if I do my 15 times table on my multiples of 15, I go 15, 30, and straight away I know, hey, 30 has a factor of 6, so 30 is the lowest common multiple of 15 and 6. So for the first 3, I just know them. For the last one, I think I might need a procedure there. I think I might need to do something to some sort of method to help me work that out, because it doesn't jump out at me like the others do. What would my students do? Well, I think my students would look at this and think, oh, all these questions about lowest common multiple. Let me see if I can remember how to do lowest common multiple. What's that procedure I have to do? I think that's what my students would do. Okay. However, if I presented them with these questions, what would you do? What would your students do? I think my students would actually be able to answer these questions without stopping and thinking, oh, what's that procedure? I think they'd look at 1/5 plus 1 over 20. And if I said to them, if the question I asked them was, what denominator shall we use here? I think a lot of them will say 20 straight away, hopefully. Or in 1/3 plus 1/8, what denominator should we use here? I think a lot of them will say, well, it's going to have to be 24. Maybe not, but I think that they've seen this from a younger age. They've seen finding appropriate lowest common denominators. They've seen this from a younger age, and I think they're much more adept at doing this than the previous questions, which had the exact same numbers. Now, I don't know what they do for that bottom one, and I don't know if they would actually make that connection and say, I don't know what the lowest common denominator is when I have a 48 and 56, but I do have a method I can use to work it out. I don't know. Obviously, we don't have to use lowest common multiples when we're working with fractions, but we know it makes life a bit easier if we do. I think this is something students are more familiar with and find easier than when it's presented in a question that has the letters LCM in it. Now have a look at that question. Think about how you do that one. Now, I don't know about you, but I think I'll do this one by listing. And I think listing is an incredibly helpful technique for a question like this. And I think probably my students would list and I would list. And I would list the 12 and 18 multiples, and it would be, the answer would come out pretty quickly. Listing is brilliant for this topic, but there are pros and cons. Okay, so listing is probably the best method for finding a lowest common multiple if the multiples are known. So for example, if I'm asked to find the lowest common multiple of 6 and 9, I would do that through listing. I do that through listing because I know the multiples of 6 and 9. So it's really, really quick to do. Okay, I would use listing because with my students, because it's so clear conceptually. There is no procedure to try and understand here. There's nothing to decipher. It's very clear. We are listing the multiples and finding the ones in common. The only skills you need to be able to do a listing approach are times tables or repeated addition, or just knowing what the word multiple is. Okay, so it's very accessible to everyone. And in contextual problems like the bus stop question, it makes a lot of sense to use a listing approach, and that would be the natural approach to use. So why don't we just teach listing for everything? Why do we start introducing all this prime stuff? Well, for a start, listing is difficult if the numbers are bigger. It can be pretty time consuming. 48 and 56, I don't really want to list the multiples of those. Understanding how primes work helps us with all sorts of lovely bits of maths. And so if we totally avoid using primes to find, to understand numbers and multiples and factors, then we're kind of missing an opportunity to really develop understanding of numbers. So there's using primes links to lots of things. Also, listing is not helpful in algebraic questions. I wouldn't find the lowest common multiple of 6xy and 4x squared by listing multiples, because that doesn't really work. You know, you could multiply it by a number or by a letter, and you know, so there is no kind of multiples there. So if we're gonna, so there we have to sort of understand actually looking at the components, looking at the parts of the terms actually tells us a lot about the terms. Have a look at that addition of two algebraic fractions. Think about how you do it, because I tell you what I see when I look at this. I see that that first fraction is missing a 2y. If I want a common denominator, that's going to have an extra 2 and a y in it, and then I will be able to start making a common denominator. For that second fraction, I'm going to need to have an x in it. And once I've multiplied the first fraction by a 2y and the second fraction by an x, I've now got my lowest common multiple. And I can do that by just understanding what it means to have a lowest common denominator there, but also because I don't need to do anything with those terms, because I can see what they're made up of. I can see how many x's, y's, and I can see the numbers that are in them. So with algebra, it's crystal clear how to do this, because we can see what the terms are made up of. And that means if I want to find the lowest common multiple of 4x squared and 8xy, I can take my 4x squared and multiply it by the bits that are missing from the second number, from the second term. So I multiply it by the bits that are missing and I'm done. If we try and do that with numbers, it's much harder because we don't know what's in those numbers. We don't know what they're made up of. But as soon as we have them written as primes, then it becomes crystal clear. I can see that my first fraction is missing a 7, and I can see that my second fraction is missing a 2 and a 3. And then if I multiply by those terms, I've got my lowest common multiple for the denominator. Now that was only clear when I did the prime factorization, but with algebra, I don't need to do the prime factorization because I can see the parts. And I think when I realized this, it kind of made a bit more sense to me about what was going on with the prime factorization. What that actually means, I'm really running out of time, so I'm going to be about 2 more minutes. What that actually means is that when it helps us to understand how, say, a Venn method works. So if you look at a Venn method, we would do the prime factorization and we put all the numbers in the Venn, all the prime factors in the Venn, and think about how this relates to what I just showed you. To find the lowest common multiple, we are taking that first denominator and multiplying it by what is missing. So we're taking that first term, or the first denominator, and we're saying, what's missing from that needs to be in there? Well, the thing that's missing is a 7. So if we multiply all those numbers in the yellow circle by 7, then we've got our lowest common multiple. It works with algebra, and it helps me to make sense of how this Venn method works. I used to teach the Venn method without really getting how it worked. Right, in my last minute, I'm going to just quickly run through some resources. I'm only going to show you 3 because I haven't got time, but there are loads for this topic. Okay, if you haven't seen it, Father of the Bride, which is now a very old film that our students will not have seen, but Father of the Bride, which is a comedy where Steve Martin goes to a supermarket and he wants to buy hot dogs and hot dog buns, and they're sold in different multiples. And there is a really funny scene you can show students when you get onto those kind of contextual problems. So that is just a really sort of funny little thing that your students might find amusing. MathsPad. It's not free, but it is brilliant for this and every topic. I love MathsPad. They have great worksheets on this, but also fantastic activities that are really, really good for building understanding of this. And finally, our hero, John Stewart, has some absolutely fantastic contextual questions and lots of rich tasks that require a lot of deep thinking from students. There are loads of other resources. You can find them from my blog, but they are just some of the highlights here. So I'd like to finish just by saying that that was very quick, but this is what I think maths department meetings should look like. We take a topic we are about to teach and we look at all of this stuff, all this stuff discussed as a department, or if you can't do that, just as an individual teacher, consider all this stuff for the topic you're about to teach, and then you will know that topic in depth. And that means that your teaching of that topic will be way better because you've taken the time to investigate and think about all of these things. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and do find me on Twitter if you want to discuss this, and my book is A Compendium of Mathematical Methods if you're interested in finding out more.
Thank you very much, Jo. That was really, really great. I'm not even a math teacher and I enjoyed that very much, so thank you. I think we have time for maybe 2 questions, and then it's 12 and I'm gonna have to let people out for lunch. So Ionis asked if you think we should be teaching the history of some of these concepts, like mathematical concepts, to the students.
Yeah, I do. I think students love it. We don't want to spend forever on it. It's like a little snippet of a lesson. The narrative we bring into the lesson means the stories we tell, the historical context. And I generally find that students find it really interesting. Like if I talk about the etymology of a word, or I talk about, I show stuff from old textbooks all the time. I suppose I might be a bit different to other teachers, but I say, hey, look, your great-grandparents would have done it this way. And I show little snippets. And I do think this makes, I do think it's really engaging. I don't think we've got enough time to do tons of stuff on that. But certainly I think sharing historical context, sharing where the topic may have come from, sharing mathematicians that have been involved in developing that topic. Like I always talk about, when I teach indices, I always talk about Descartes and how it was his notation that was introduced, and I show them a picture of Descartes and all that sort of thing. So I think little bits of it is absolutely lovely, and I think it's really engaging for students.
Yep, great. And Jane asked, how would you go about evaluating and choosing a method for the whole department? What issues would you take into account?
That's really tough because, like I say, I teach a different method to my colleagues here. And I think there's a really good blog post where someone did this recently for factorizing non-monic quadratics. And what they did was the whole department sat round and had a really long, like for a whole hour, they played with methods for this particular topic. And they pulled them apart, they discussed them in detail, they discussed their experiences of them. And in the end, they voted. And they figured out which one in general they were going to teach. The thing is, though, what I would always suggest is, if you're going to enforce a method, you say, I'd like all students to have seen this method, but it's okay for teachers to also teach other ones. So, for example, I might say, I think that all students should see the grid method for expanding double brackets, but I don't mind if teachers also say to their students, by the way, there's other ways of doing it. So I think, it is hard to agree. I think a big long discussion and then a voting thing might help, but also not forcing teachers to do things, but maybe saying to them that all students need to have seen this one particular thing, but they can see others as well.
Yeah, sounds good. And well, you answered very quickly, so we have time for one more. How do you help learners to thinking alternative methods for maths to be able to do it automatically in an exam? So to be able to choose between different methods during an exam?
There's lots of tools that can help students to select the method. I think, the interesting thing here is that there'll be some lowest common multiple questions where we'll say, I want to use a listing approach. And there'll be some lowest common multiple questions where we say, actually, I'm going to have to use some primes here because it's too hard to do with listing. And I suppose there's just that's just experience. And I suppose we need to give our students lots of experience of all the different types of questions. I don't think there's kind of a magic answer to that where we can just say automatically we can make it so our students know which ones to choose. Even as maths teachers, we might choose different methods, where I might choose to list multiples, other teachers might choose not to. So there's no kind of right method to use, but we can certainly just through giving our students lots of experiences and modeling us doing it. So it's good if I can show my students a question, me seeing a question I've not seen before, and then I say to them, right, I've not seen this one before. Let me tell you what's going on in my head. Let me tell you how I'm choosing how I'm going to answer this question. And if I'd answered it in a different way, what would that look like? So I think, you know, modeling us answering questions is probably quite helpful there.
Amazing. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody who was here today. That was great. That was really, really great. Like I say, I'm not even a maths teacher and I like all the talks very much. Thank you. On that link, you have links to YouTube where this talk is being recorded, Google folder with all the slides, Joe's course on Seneca, all the other hundreds of free Seneca CPD and student material for free. And please thank all the speakers and the organizers on Twitter as well. All the handles are on the blog post. So thank you very much and have a great Saturday, everybody.
Keep organizing it.
Thank you. And use the hashtag Seneca CPD, please. Okay, bye.